Anderson Silva, 2,457 days as champion. Anderson Silva held the UFC middleweight title for 2,457 days. That is 6 years, 8 months, and 19 days. Nearly 7 years as the undisputed champion of his division. He won the belt from Rich Franklin on October 14, 2006, and didn't lose it until Chris Weidman knocked him out on July 6, 2013. During that reign, he defended the title 10 times. He fought the best middleweights on the planet twice a year for almost 7 years, and none of them could take the belt from him. To put that number in perspective, the second longest title reign in UFC history belongs to Demetrious Johnson at flyweight with 1,607 days. That is 850 days shorter than Silva's reign. Silva held the title nearly 2.5 years longer than the second longest champion. In the modern UFC, fighters defend their belts 2 or 3 times a year at most. Champions get injured. They take time off. They lose. The idea of someone holding a single title for nearly 7 straight years in today's era of competition is basically impossible. The talent pool is too deep. The matchmaking is too aggressive. The number of elite contenders at every weight class is higher than it has ever been. 2,457 days. Nobody is touching that. Demetrious Johnson, 11 consecutive title defenses. Demetrious Johnson defended the UFC flyweight title 11 times in a row in a single weight class. That distinction matters because Jon Jones has 11 title defenses across 2 divisions, a light heavyweight and heavyweight. Johnson did all 11 at flyweight without ever moving up or down. He won the inaugural flyweight championship in September 2012 and then defended it against every single contender the UFC put in front of him for 5 straight years. He beat John Dodson twice. He beat Joseph Benavidez twice. He beat Henry Cejudo. He beat Tim Elliott. He beat Wilson Race. He beat Ali Bogotinov. He beat Chris Carriasso. He beat John Moraga. He beat Kyoji Horiguchi. And in his 11th and final defense, he submitted Ray Borg with a flying armbar in the 5th round. That is considered one of the most technically brilliant submissions in UFC history. He suplexed Borg mid-air and transitioned directly into the armbar in one motion. Now, that single finish broke Anderson Silva's record of 10 consecutive title defenses and set a new standard that nobody has come close to matching. The closest anyone has come since is Alexander Volkanovski, with 5 consecutive defenses at featherweight. Islam Makhachev has 4 at lightweight. Nobody is halfway to 11. The flyweight division that Johnson dominated has produced multiple champions since he left, and none of them have been able to hold the belt for more than 2 or 3 defenses. Johnson did it 11 times, against everyone, without ever looking like he was in real danger of losing. That's the definition of unbreakable. Charles Oliveira, most finishes, most submissions, and most performance bonuses in UFC history. Charles Oliveira holds 4 major UFC records simultaneously. Most submission wins at 16, most finishes at 21, most performance bonuses at 21, and most wins in the lightweight division. He holds more records than some fighters have wins. What makes these records almost impossible to break is the combination of volume, longevity, and finishing ability required. Oliveira has been fighting in the UFC since 2010. He started his career at featherweight, struggled, lost multiple times, nearly got cut from the roster, then moved up to lightweight and went on one of the greatest runs in UFC history. He won 11 fights in a row between 2018 and 2022, finishing almost all of them. He submitted Kevin Lee, he submitted Tony Ferguson, he TKO'd Michael Chandler to win the lightweight title. He submitted Dustin Poirier, he submitted Justin Gaethje. His submission game is the most diverse in UFC history. Rear naked chokes, guillotines, triangles, anaconda chokes, calf slicers. He can submit you from anywhere, and he's also a knockout threat, which is what makes the total finishes record so staggering. 21 finishes in the UFC. To break that record, a fighter would need to finish more than 21 opponents in the UFC alone, not in their overall career, in the UFC. That requires getting into the UFC young, staying healthy, fighting consistently, and finishing people at an elite rate for over a decade. Nobody else has done it, and nobody else is on pace to do it. Jorge Masvidal, 5-second knockout. Jorge Masvidal knocked out Ben Askren in 5 seconds at UFC 239 on July 6, 2019. 5 seconds. The bell rang. Masvidal sprinted directly across the octagon. Askren ducked his head to shoot for a takedown. Masvidal launched a flying knee that connected with the top of Askren's skull. Askren was unconscious before he hit the ground. The referee jumped in immediately. It was over. 5 seconds from bell to finish. It was the fastest knockout in UFC history, and it might be the fastest knockout that is physically possible. The previous record was held by Dwayne Ludwig at 6 seconds. Masvidal shaved a full second off that. To beat this record, a fighter would need to knock someone out in 4 seconds or less. That means sprinting at your opponent and landing a perfect strike within the first 3 to 4 seconds seconds of the fight. The margin for error is 0. You have to predict exactly what your opponent is going to do in the opening moment, commit to a technique before the fight even starts, and execute it perfectly. Masvidal admitted after the fight that he had studied Askren's tendency to duck and shoot for takedowns, and designed the flying knee specifically for that opening exchange. It was calculated violence at the highest level, 4 seconds or less to beat it. That's not happening. Conor McGregor, 13-second title, fight knockout. Conor McGregor knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds at UFC 194 on December 12, 2015, to win the featherweight championship. It was the fastest finish in UFC title fight history. Aldo had been the featherweight champion for over a decade. He had not lost a fight since 2005. He was considered one of the greatest fighters of all time. He came out aggressively, threw a right hand, and McGregor slipped it and countered with a left hook that landed flush on Aldo's jaw. Aldo went down. McGregor followed up with one more shot. The referee stopped it. 13 seconds. A 10-year reign of dominance ended by a single punch from a man who predicted it would happen exactly that way. Before the fight, McGregor said he saw himself slipping Aldo's right hand and coming back with his own left. That is precisely what happened. He called the shot and then executed it in 13 seconds against the best featherweight who had ever lived. Ronda Rousey's 14-second armbar of Kat Zingano was the previous fastest title fight finish, but McGregor's carries more weight because of the context. Aldo was not a late replacement or an unproven challenger. He was the longest reigning champion in UFC history at the time. McGregor starched him in 13 seconds. To beat this record, you would need to finish a title fight in 12 seconds or less. That means knocking out or submitting a champion in roughly the same time it takes to read this sentence. Unbreakable. Ronda Rousey, 14-second submission. Ronda Rousey submitted Kat Zingano with an armbar in 14 seconds at UFC 184 on February 28, 2015. It was the fastest submission in UFC title fight history and tied for the fastest submission in any UFC fight. Zingano charged at Rousey at the opening bell. Rousey used the momentum against her, tripped her, locked up the arm, and transitioned into an armbar so quickly that the entire sequence was over before most people in the arena had even sat down. Rousey admitted after the fight that the armbar was completely improvised. She didn't plan it. She saw the arm, took it, and finished the fight in 14 seconds. What makes this record nearly unbreakable is that submissions take time. Unlike a knockout where a single punch can end a fight instantly, a submission requires you to secure a position, isolate a limb or the neck, and apply enough pressure to force a tap or put someone to sleep. Doing all of that in 14 seconds is absurd. It required Rousey's opponent to charge directly at her, give up a dominant position immediately, and leave her arm completely exposed. That sequence of events happening in the first 14 seconds of a title fight is so unlikely that it may never happen again. Jim Miller. Most fights and most wins in UFC history. Jim Miller has fought in the UFC more times than any other fighter in the history of the promotion. As of his most recent fight, Miller has competed in over 45 UFC bouts across a career that spans from 2008 to the present. He also holds the record for most wins in UFC history with 27. He has been fighting in the UFC for nearly 18 years. To put that in context, most UFC fighters have careers that last 5 to 8 years before injuries, age, or losses force them out. Miller has lasted more than double the average career length, and he's still competing. He fights at lightweight, one of the deepest and most competitive divisions in the sport. He has wins by knockout, submission, and decision. He has earned multiple performance bonuses. He has a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he has Lyme disease, which he was diagnosed with in 2013, and has managed throughout the second half of his career. He's been fighting with a chronic illness for over a decade, and still holds the record for most wins in UFC history. The only way to break this record is to get into the UFC young, stay healthy enough to compete for nearly 2 decades, win consistently enough to not get cut, and keep coming back fight after fight after fight. Miller has done all of that in the most competitive division in the sport while fighting a chronic disease. That combination of longevity, durability, and consistency is virtually impossible to replicate. Derrick Lewis, 16 knockouts. Derrick Lewis has 16 knockouts in the UFC, more than any other fighter in the history of the promotion. Not 16 finishes, 16 knockouts. Clean knockouts where someone went unconscious or was stopped on their feet or on the ground from strikes. He knocked out Alexander Volkov with 11 seconds left in the fight after being dominated for 3 rounds. He knocked out Curtis Blades. He knocked out Chris Daukaus. He knocked out Alexei Oleinik. He knocked out Blagoy Ivanov. He has been knocking people out in the UFC heavyweight division since 2014, and he is still doing it over a decade later. What makes this record so difficult to break is the division, heavyweight, the most dangerous division in the sport where every fighter has one-punch knockout power. Lewis isn't just knocking out cants, he's knocking out ranked heavyweights, former title challengers, and legitimate top 10 fighters. He does it with raw power, no technique, no setup, just pure terrifying knockout ability. The next closest fighter to this record is Matt Brown with 13 knockouts across his career, and Lewis has 3 more. To break this record, a heavyweight would need to knock out 17 or more people in the UFC. That requires staying in the promotion long enough fighting consistently, and having the kind of power that puts people to sleep fight after fight. Lewis has been doing it for over a decade. Nobody else has come close. Jon Jones, 16 title fight wins. Jon Jones won 16 title fights in the UFC, more than any other fighter in the history of the sport. He won the light heavyweight championship at 23 years old by TKO over Shogun Rua at UFC 128 in March 2011, becoming the youngest champion in UFC history. He then defended that title against Rampage Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, Daniel Cormier, Ovince St. Preux, and Anthony Smith. He moved up to heavyweight and submitted Cyril Gane in the first round to win the heavyweight title at UFC 285. He defended it against Stipe Miocic at UFC 309 with a third-round TKO via spinning back kick. 16 title fights, 16 wins. Across 2 weight classes and over 14 years of competition, he never lost a title fight. The only loss on his record is a disqualification against Matt Hamill for 12-6 elbows in a fight he was dominating. He was never knocked out. He was never outpointed in a title fight. He retired in June 2025 without ever being legitimately beaten. The next closest fighters to this record are Georges St-Pierre and Demetrius Johnson with 13 title fight wins each. Jones has 3 more than both of them. To break this record, a fighter would need to win 17 title fights. That means winning a championship, defending it more than a dozen times across potentially 2 weight classes, and doing it all without ever losing a title fight. In the modern UFC, where the talent pool is deeper than ever, the idea of someone winning 17 title fights is almost inconceivable. Jones did 16. Nobody is catching him. Jim Miller, most fights without a title shot. Jim Miller has fought in the UFC 46 times. That is the most of any fighter in the history of the promotion. More than Andrei Arlovsky, more than Donald Cerrone, more than Clay Guida or Charles Oliveira or anyone else who has ever stepped inside the octagon. 46 times he showed up, made weight, and fought. And across all 46 of those appearances, he never once fought for a UFC championship. Not even close. Miller debuted in the UFC in 2008 and went on a 7-fight win streak between 2009 and 2011 that included finishes over Mark Bocek, Dwayne Ludwig, and Charles Oliveira. At that point, he was ranked in the top 10 at lightweight, and there was genuine conversation about whether he could challenge for the belt. It never happened. The title shot went to other fighters. He lost to Benson Henderson and then to Nate Diaz, and the window closed. He has 27 wins in his professional MMA career. 21 of those came by submission. He holds the record for the most wins in UFC history. He holds the record for the most submissions in MMA history. And yes, not UFC, that's Charles. MMA specifically. He has been fighting professionally for over 20 years, and he is still on the active roster at 42 years old. His record is 38-19 with 1 no contest across 58 professional fights. He has more octagon time than almost anyone who has ever competed, and he never got the one fight that every single fighter in the UFC is working towards. 46 fights, 0 title shots. Nobody is breaking that record because nobody else is going to fight that many times in the UFC without the promotion giving them a crack at the belt somewhere along the way. Jim Miller did it, and he kept showing up anyway. Tony Ferguson, longest losing streak. Tony Ferguson's losing streak is the worst in UFC history. 8 consecutive losses, not 7. 8. BJ Penn held the record for years with 7 straight defeats, and most people assume that was a number nobody would ever match. Ferguson matched it against Paddy Pimblett at UFC 296 in December 2023, and then broke it outright against Michael Chiesa in August 2024 when he was submitted by rear naked choke in the first round. His record now stands at 25-11, but the numbers alone do not capture how brutal this streak was or why it might genuinely be unbreakable. Ferguson was the interim UFC lightweight champion. He won 12 fights in a row between 2013 and 2019 and was ranked number 1 in the division for years. He was supposed to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov 5 separate times. The fight fell through every single time. Injuries, weight cuts, a freak accident where Ferguson tripped over a cable and tore his knee ligament during a media obligation. By the time the streak started with the Justin Gaethje fight at UFC 249 in May 2020, something had already changed. Ferguson looked slower. He absorbed punishment he would have slipped 2 years earlier. Gaethje broke him down over 5 rounds and the fight was stopped in the 5th. Then came Charles Oliveira by unanimous decision. Beneil Dariush by unanimous decision. A first-round knockout loss to Michael Chandler that produced one of the most violent front kicks in UFC history. Bobby Green submitted him. Nate Diaz beat him by unanimous decision. Paddy Pimblett submitted him. Michael Chiesa submitted him. 8 fights, 0 wins, 4 finishes against him. And the UFC kept booking him. They kept feeding him to younger fighters who needed a name on their record. El Cucuy went from being one of the most feared lightweights in history to the guy they gave to prospects on their way up. Nobody is going to break this record because the UFC would never let a fighter of any significant name value lose 8 times in a row again. They didn't protect Ferguson. They let it happen. And he kept saying yes to every fight because that was who he was. Charles Oliveira, most missed weights, Charles Oliveira has missed weight 6 times in his UFC career. That is the most of any fighter in the history of the promotion. 5 of those misses came when he was fighting at featherweight between 2012 and 2016. The 6th came at the worst possible moment. At UFC 274 in May 2022, Oliveira was the reigning UFC lightweight champion preparing to defend his belt against Justin Gaethje. He stepped on the scale and weighed in at 155.5 pounds, half a pound over the championship limit. For non-title fights, the UFC allows a 1-pound grace period. For championship fights, there is no grace period at all. Oliveira was stripped of the title on the scale. He went out the next night and knocked Gaethje out in the first round. He won the fight, but he could not win the belt because he was no longer the champion when the cage door closed. That is the record that defines Oliveira's career as much as his incredible finishing ability. His overall record is 35-10 with 1 no contest across 37 UFC bouts. He holds the record for most finishes in UFC history with 20. He holds the record for most submission wins in UFC history with 16. He went on an 11-fight win streak that included victories over Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and Michael Chandler. He is one of the most dangerous fighters who has ever competed, and 6 times across his career he could not make the weight limit. The featherweight misses were bad. He came in nearly 10 pounds over against Ricardo Lamas in November 2016, which was the final straw that forced his permanent move up to lightweight. But it was the Gaethje miss that everyone remembers because it cost him the title in real time. No other fighter in UFC history has missed weight 6 times and remained on the roster. Oliveira survived it because he was too good to cut. That is a record nobody else could get away with. Ben Askren, fastest knockout loss. 5 seconds. That is how long it took Jorge Masvidal to knock out Ben Askren at UFC 239 in July 2019. It is the fastest knockout in UFC history and one of the most replayed moments in the history of combat sports. Askren entered the octagon that night with a professional record of 19-0 with 1 no contest. He was an Olympic wrestler, a 2-time NCAA Division I national champion from the University of Missouri, the longest reigning Bellator welterweight champion in that promotion's history, the longest reigning 1 championship welterweight champion. He had never been beaten. He had never even been in serious trouble. His wrestling was so dominant that most opponents spent entire fights on their backs trying to survive. And then the bell rang, and Masvidal sprinted across the octagon and hit him with a flying knee that connected flush under the chin before Askren had taken a single step forward. The knee landed at the 3-second mark. The follow-up punches that referee Jason Herzog waved off came at the 5-second mark. Askren was unconscious before his body hit the canvas. His legs buckled and he dropped face first, and Masvidal landed 2 more shots on the ground before the stoppage. The previous record for fastest knockout in the UFC was held by Dwayne Ludwig at 6 seconds. That record had stood since 2006. Nobody thought it would ever be broken. The image of Askren lying motionless on the canvas while Masvidal celebrated became the defining visual of that entire UFC year. Askren fought twice more after that loss. He beat Demian Maia by split decision at UFC Fight Night in October 2019 and then was submitted by Maia in what turned out to be his final fight. He retired with a record of 19-2, but nobody remembers the retirement. They remember the knee. 5 seconds, the fastest knockout in UFC history. That record is functionally unbreakable because you cannot knock someone out faster than before the fight has started, and Masvidal came as close to that as physics allows. Andrei Arlovski, most damage absorbed at heavyweight. Andrei Arlovski has absorbed more significant strikes than any heavyweight in UFC history. Over 1,500 significant strikes landed clean across 42 UFC bouts at heavyweight. That is a record built over 2 decades of getting hit by the biggest men in the sport. Arlovski was the UFC heavyweight champion in 2005 and 2006. He won the belt by stopping Tim Sylvia with a first-round Achilles lock and defended it twice before losing it back to Sylvia by TKO. His overall record is 34-24 with 2 no contests across 60 professional fights. 12 of his 24 losses came by knockout or TKO. That is an extraordinary amount of brain trauma for any fighter in any division, but at heavyweight, where every punch carries genuine finishing power, it is staggering. The reason Arlovski absorbed so much damage is simple. He never stopped fighting. He competed in the UFC across 3 separate stints spanning from 2000 to 2023. He fought Fedor Emelianenko. He fought Fabricio Werdum. He fought Alistair Overeem. He fought Stipe Miocic. He fought Tai Tuivasa. He fought Jairzinho Rozenstruik. He fought across 4 different decades of heavyweight MMA, and he absorbed punishment from every generation of heavy hitters the division has produced. The man is 47 years old now and competing in bare-knuckle boxing. 1,500 significant strikes absorbed at heavyweight. Nobody is going to come close to that number because the UFC will never again allow a heavyweight to fight 42 times in the promotion. The sport has evolved past that. Medical protocols have tightened. Arlovski competed in an era where they would let you keep fighting until you stopped showing up. And he never stopped showing up. Kelvin Gastelum, worst single weight miss. Kelvin Gastelum weighed in at 180 pounds for a welterweight fight against Tyron Woodley at UFC 183 in January 2015. The welterweight limit is 171 pounds. That meant Gastelum was 9 pounds over the limit. 9 pounds. Not 1, not 2, 9. For context, most weight misses in the UFC are between half a pound and 2 pounds. Fighters regularly miss by fractions of an ounce. Gastelum showed up 9 pounds heavy for a fight against a man who would become the welterweight champion 1 year later. He was fined 30% of his purse and lost the fight by split decision. But that was not even his first missed weight. He had already missed weight against Nico Musoka in 2014. After the Woodley miss, the UFC moved him up to middleweight permanently. And then in September 2025 at UFC Noche, fighting at middleweight where the limit is 186 pounds, he missed weight again by more than 5 pounds, coming in at 191. This is a man who has missed weight at welterweight and at middleweight. He has missed weight across 2 different divisions, years apart. His body simply does not cooperate with weight cutting, and yet he keeps trying to make limits that his frame was never built for. Gastelum stands 5 feet 9 inches tall. He won the Ultimate Fighter Season 17 at middleweight. His natural weight has always been closer to 200 pounds than to 170, and yet for years the UFC let him compete at welterweight, where he was cutting nearly 30 pounds. The 9-pound miss against Woodley remains the single biggest weight miss in modern UFC history, and it is a record that nobody is going to break, because the UFC will simply pull a fighter from a card before they let someone step on the scale 9 pounds over. Diego Sanchez. Most decisions in UFC history. Diego Sanchez has gone to a judge's decision 23 times across his UFC career. That is the most of any fighter in the history of the promotion. His record is 30-14 across 44 professional fights, and 32 of those came inside the UFC octagon. 23 of those 32 UFC bouts went the full distance. That means in roughly 70% of his UFC fights, nobody got finished. Sanchez won the Ultimate Fighter Season 1 in 2005 at middleweight. He fought across 4 different weight classes in the UFC middleweight, welterweight, lightweight, featherweight. He challenged for the UFC lightweight championship against BJ Penn at UFC 107 in 2009 and lost by unanimous decision. His 3 Wrestling Observer Newsletter Fight of the Year awards are tied for the most of any fighter in history. His fight against Clay Guida at the Ultimate Fighter 9 finale is still considered one of the greatest bouts in UFC history. But the reason Sanchez went to the judges so often is because he was never quite dangerous enough to finish elite opponents and never quite vulnerable enough to get finished himself. He had good hands but not knockout power. He had solid grappling but not elite submissions. What he had was heart. Absurd, unreasonable, sometimes self-destructive heart. He would walk forward through punishment that would stop most fighters and keep throwing until the final bell. The result was fight after fight that went the full 3 or 5 rounds because Sanchez would not go down and could not put anyone away. 23 decisions. Nobody will touch that number because the UFC no longer keeps fighters around long enough to accumulate that many bouts without finishes. The sport moves faster now. Sanchez lasted because he came from an era where longevity was rewarded and entertainment value kept you on the roster, even when you weren't winning. Justin Gaethje. Most knockdowns absorbed in a single fight. Justin Gaethje and Eddie Alvarez combined for 7 knockdowns in their fight at UFC 218 in December 2017. That is the most knockdowns in a single bout in UFC history. Both men hit the canvas multiple times across 3 rounds of absolute carnage before Alvarez finished Gaethje by TKO in the 3rd round. Gaethje entered that fight with a record of 18-0. He was the former World Series of Fighting lightweight champion. He had just knocked out Michael Johnson in his UFC debut in one of the most violent fights the promotion had ever seen. And then Alvarez showed him what it looks like when 2 fighters with genuine power refuse to take a step backwards. The fight was chaos from the opening bell. Gaethje rocked Alvarez early with leg kicks and punches that dropped him. Alvarez came back and dropped Gaethje with a counter right hand. They traded knockdowns back and forth across 3 rounds in a pattern that nobody in the arena could predict. Every time one man went down, the other swarmed, and every time the man on the ground somehow survived and got back to his feet. Gaethje absorbs 7.58 significant strikes per minute. That is one of the highest rates in lightweight history. He has earned a post-fight bonus in nearly every UFC appearance he has ever made. He is one of the most violent and exciting fighters the sport has ever produced. But the Alvarez fight is the one that defined who Gaethje is at his core. 7 combined knockdowns in a single fight. To break that record, you would need 2 fighters who both possess genuine knockout power, both refuse to clinch or go to the ground after hurting their opponent, and both survive multiple knockdowns in the same bout. That combination almost never happens. Gaethje and Alvarez gave the UFC something it had never seen before. before and has never seen since. Donald Cerrone, most losses by a UFC Hall of Famer. Donald Cerrone retired from the UFC with a record of 36-17 with 2 no contests, 17 losses. He was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame in July 2023. No other Hall of Famer in any combat sport has a record with that many defeats. Cerrone's career is one of the strangest in MMA history because the things that made him great are the exact same things that produced those 17 losses. He fought anyone. He fought anywhere. He fought on any notice. He holds the record for the most wins in UFC history with 23. He holds the record for the most finishes in UFC history with 16. He holds the record for the most post-fight bonuses in UFC history with 18. He fought 38 times in the UFC across 11 years in both the lightweight and welterweight divisions. And he lost 17 of those fights because he never said no to a matchup. He took fights on short notice against killers. He accepted title eliminators he wasn't prepared for. He moved up to welterweight and fought bigger men because they asked him to. He fought Conor McGregor at UFC 246 in January 2020 and was finished by TKO in 40 seconds. He fought Tony Ferguson and lost by TKO in the second round. He fought Justin Gaethje and was stopped in the first round by strikes to the body. He fought Rafael dos Anjos twice and lost both times. He ended his career on a 6-fight losing streak, the longest of his career, with his final win coming against Al Yaquinta in May 2019. Every single one of those losses came because Cerrone accepted fights he didn't have to take against opponents who were better than him on that night. 17 losses. Most of any fighter in the UFC Hall of Fame. That record will never be broken because the modern UFC doesn't let fighters accumulate that many losses and still put them in main events. Cerrone got to do it because fans loved watching him fight regardless of the result. Cowboy walked in, Cowboy fought, and whatever happened, happened. 17 times it didn't go his way. He never once complained about it. BJ Penn, only Hall of Famer with a losing record. BJ Penn's professional record is 16-14-2, more losses than wins. He is the only fighter in the UFC Hall of Fame whose record is below 500. Every other Hall of Famer retired with more victories than defeats. Anderson Silva, Georges St-Pierre, Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes, Randy Couture, even fighters who stayed too long and lost fights they shouldn't have taken, still walked away with winning records. Penn did not. And the reason that record is so painful is because of what came before it. Penn won the UFC Lightweight Championship at UFC 46 in 2004 by knocking out Matt Hughes in the first round to claim the welterweight title. He became only the second fighter in UFC history to hold titles in 2 different weight classes. He was the first non-Brazilian to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship at black belt level. He defended the lightweight title 3 times, beating Sean Shirk, Joe Stevenson, and Kenny Florian. At his peak between 2004 and 2010, BJ Penn was considered one of the 5 greatest fighters on the planet. His boxing was sharp. His jiu-jitsu was generational. His ability to fight at multiple weight classes when almost nobody else even attempted it was ahead of its time. He fought at featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, and even openweight across his career. 5 different divisions. Nobody else has done that. But Penn could never walk away. He retired after losing to Frankie Edgar in 2014, and came back in 2017 when he had nothing left. He lost to Yair Rodriguez, he lost to Dennis Siver, he lost to Ryan Hall. Each time he looked slower, older, further from the fighter who once made champions look ordinary. His record before the comeback was 16-10-2. Not great, but respectable for a man who fought across 5 weight classes against the best in the world. The 4 extra losses he added between 2017 and 2019 are the ones that dragged him below 500. He came back for fights he did not need to take and lost them all. Now his record reads 16-14-2 for the rest of history. A 2-division champion, a Hall of Famer, a jiu-jitsu legend, and the only man in the UFC Hall of Fame who lost more fights than he won. That record is unbreakable because the UFC will never again induct someone whose record looks like that. Penn got in because of who he was at his best. His record is what it is because he couldn't stop chasing who he used to be. The 12-6 elbow. For over 20 years, it was illegal to throw an elbow straight down from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the UFC. Every other angle of elbow was perfectly legal. You could throw horizontal elbows, diagonal elbows, spinning back elbows, and rising elbows. But if your elbow came straight down from above, it was a foul. The rule was inspired by martial arts demonstrations where practitioners broke blocks of ice by driving their elbows straight down. The athletic commissioners who wrote the original unified rules of mixed martial arts in 2001 saw those demonstrations and decided that a 12-6 elbow was too dangerous for competition. The most famous consequence of this rule was Jon Jones' disqualification loss to Matt Hamill at the Ultimate Fighter Season 10 finale in December 2009. Jones was dominating the fight and threw downward elbows to Hamill's forehead. The referee stopped the fight and Jones was disqualified. It is officially the only loss on Jon Jones' record, and it came from a rule that most fighters and analysts considered absurd. In July 2024, the Association of Boxing Commissions voted to remove the 12-6 elbow ban from the unified rules effective November 1st, 2024. The rule lasted 23 years. It is now legal to throw an elbow in any direction, the grounded fighter definition. Before 2017, a fighter was considered grounded if they had one hand or one knee on the canvas. A grounded fighter cannot be kicked or kneed in the head. Fighters figured out how to exploit this almost immediately. If a fighter was in danger of being kneed in the face while in a scramble, they would place one fingertip on the canvas. That single fingertip made them a grounded fighter, and their opponent could not throw knees to the head without being penalized. It was a loophole, and fighters used it constantly. The most notorious example was in grappling exchanges where one fighter would touch the mat with an open palm specifically to prevent their opponent from throwing knees. In 2017, the unified rules were updated. Under the new definition, a fighter is only grounded if they have two hands, two knees, or any combination of a hand and a knee on the canvas. One hand alone no longer qualifies. The change was designed to close the fingertip loophole and encourage more dynamic grappling exchanges. Not every state athletic commission adopted the new rules immediately, which created confusion when fights took place in jurisdictions that were still using the old definition. Groin strikes are not an automatic disqualification. Most fans assume that a groin strike in the UFC results in an immediate disqualification. It does not. Under the unified rules, an unintentional groin strike is a foul but not a fight-ending one. The fighter who was struck is given up to 5 minutes to recover. If they can continue after the recovery period, the fight resumes. If they cannot continue and the strike was ruled unintentional, the result is a no contest if the fight has not gone past the halfway point, or a technical decision based on the scorecards if it has. Only an intentional groin strike results in a disqualification. The 5-minute recovery period has led to some bizarre moments in UFC history where a fighter is lying on the canvas, holding their groin while the referee counts down and the crowd watches in uncomfortable silence. Groin strikes happen far more often than most people realize. The thin layer of protection provided by a standard MMA cup does not prevent all impact, and fighters get hit in the groin in nearly every other event. Timidity is a foul. Under Section 15 of the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, timidity is listed as a foul. The rule defines timidity as avoiding contact with an opponent, consistently dropping the mouthpiece, or faking an injury. A fighter can theoretically be penalized for refusing to engage. In practice, this rule is almost never enforced. Fighters have spent entire rounds backing up against the cage without throwing a single strike, and referees have not deducted points. Tyron Woodley's fights against Kamaru Usman and Stephen Thompson are frequently cited as examples of fights where one competitor appeared to be avoiding contact for extended periods without consequence. The timidity rule exists on paper to prevent fighters from running away for 15 or 25 minutes, but referees are reluctant to enforce it because the line between being cautious and being timid is subjective, and penalizing a fighter for not engaging aggressively enough could change the outcome of a fight in a way that feels arbitrary. No spiking on the head. Pile driving an opponent onto their head or neck is illegal under the unified rules. The rule exists to prevent catastrophic spinal injuries. A spike is defined as a move where one fighter picks up the other and drives them headfirst into the canvas with the full weight of both fighters behind the impact. Matt Hughes was famous for his suplexes and slams during his reign as welterweight champion, and several of his throws came dangerously close to the spiking threshold. The distinction between a legal slam and an illegal spike comes down to the angle of the opponent's body when they hit the canvas. If the opponent lands on their upper back or shoulders, the throw is legal. If they land directly on the top of their head with their body vertical, it is a spike, and it is a foul. The rule has been enforced only a handful of times in UFC history because most illegal spikes happen accidentally during scrambles rather than deliberately. Referee stand-ups have no time limit. There is no rule in the unified rules that specifies how long fighters can remain on the ground before the referee stands them up. The decision to stand fighters up for inactivity is entirely at the referee's discretion. Some referees will stand fighters up after 15 or 20 seconds of minimal action on the ground. Others will let fighters lie in a position with no activity for 2 or 3 minutes before intervening. This inconsistency is one of the most controversial aspects of MMA officiating. Wrestlers and grapplers who work for dominant positions on the ground often feel penalized when a referee stands them up before they can advance. Strikers often feel frustrated when they are held on the ground for minutes at a time with no offensive action from the top fighter. The lack of a defined time limit means that the outcome of a fight can be significantly influenced by which referee is assigned to the bout and how that particular referee interprets ground activity. Corner stoppages override the fighter. A fighter's corner can throw in the towel at any time during a bout, and the fight is immediately stopped. This rule overrides the fighter's desire to continue, and even overrides the referee's assessment of the situation. Once the towel enters the cage, the fight is over. One of the most notable corner stoppages in recent UFC history occurred at UFC on Fox 30 in July 2018, when Eddie Alvarez's corner threw in the towel during his fight with Dustin Poirier. Alvarez was being battered in the second round, and his corner made the decision to stop the fight to protect him. Alvarez was upset. He believed he could have continued continued, but the corner's authority in that situation is absolute. Despite being a clear and established rule, corner stoppages remain rare in the UFC. Most corners are reluctant to stop a fight because of the cultural expectation in combat sports that fighters should be given every opportunity to come back. This reluctance has led to situations where fighters have absorbed unnecessary punishment because their corner refused to intervene. Headbutts used to be legal. In the earliest UFC events before the unified rules were adopted in 2001, headbutts were a legal and commonly used technique. Mark Coleman, the UFC heavyweight champion and former Olympic wrestler, used headbutts effectively from top position during his dominant run in the late 1990s. He would take opponents down with his wrestling and then drive his forehead into their face and nose while maintaining top control. It was brutal and effective. Headbutts were banned when the unified rules were introduced because they were considered too dangerous and too difficult to regulate. The damage a headbutt can cause to both the person being headbutted and the person delivering it, including cuts, fractures, and concussions, was deemed too significant to allow in sanctioned competition. The ban on headbutts is one of the rules that separates modern MMA from the early no-holds-barred era. Greasing is a foul and it changed the championship. Vaseline is applied to a fighter's face before every round to reduce the risk of cuts from punches and elbows. It is legal on the face. It is not legal on the body. At UFC 94 in January 2009, Georges St-Pierre fought BJ Penn for the welterweight championship. Between rounds, a camera caught GSP's cornerman Phil Nurse rubbing his hands on GSP's face and then wiping them across GSP's shoulders and upper back. The implication was that Vaseline residue was being transferred from GSP's face to his body, making him more difficult to control in the clinch and on the ground. GSP won the fight by TKO in the 4th round. Penn's camp filed an official complaint. The Nevada State Athletic Commission investigated and determined that while the transfer of Vaseline had occurred, it was not intentional and did not warrant overturning the result. The incident became known as Greasegate and led to new protocols requiring that athletic commission officials, not cornermen, apply Vaseline to fighters before each round. The rule change affected every UFC event going forward. Cage grabbing is almost never punished. Grabbing the cage with your fingers or toes is a foul under the unified rules. It is also one of the most commonly committed and least commonly punished fouls in MMA. Fighters grab the fence to prevent takedowns, to stand up from bottom position, and to maintain their balance during scrambles. Referees see it happen constantly. In the vast majority of cases, the referee issues a verbal warning, and the action continues with no point deduction. Daniel Cormier was notorious for grabbing the cage during grappling exchanges. Derrick Lewis has been caught hooking his toes through the fence on multiple occasions. The reason cage grabbing is rarely punished is that referees are reluctant to deduct points for a foul that happens in a split second during a scramble and often has a minimal impact on the outcome. The result is that fighters continue to grab the cage because the worst case scenario is a warning, and the best case scenario is preventing a takedown that could cost them the fight. You cannot throw someone out of the cage. It is explicitly stated in the unified rules that a fighter may not throw or push their opponent out of the fighting area. If a fighter were to pick up their opponent and throw them over the fence or through the cage wall, it would be ruled a foul. This rule exists primarily for safety reasons, since the area outside the cage includes camera operators, judges, and commission officials who could be injured by a fighter being ejected from the fighting area. The rule has never been enforced in a UFC bout because no fighter has ever successfully thrown an opponent out of the cage. But it is technically possible given the physical capabilities of some heavyweight fighters and the fact that the cage fence is only 5.5 feet tall. The 1-pound allowance only applies to non-title fights. For non-championship bouts in the UFC, fighters are allowed a 1-pound grace period above the weight class limit. A welterweight fighting a non-title bout can weigh up to 171 pounds and still be considered on weight. For championship fights, there is no grace period at all. This distinction is why Charles Oliveira was stripped of his UFC lightweight championship at UFC 274 in May 2022. He weighed in at 155.5 pounds, half a pound over the 155-pound limit. In a non-title fight, that weight would have been acceptable, but because it was a championship fight, the 1-pound allowance did not apply. Oliveira lost his title on the scale. He then went out the next night and knocked out Justin Gaethje in the first round, but could not win back the belt he had been stripped of because he was no longer the champion when the fight started. It is one of the most painful technicalities in UFC history. Pride rules were a completely different sport. Pride fighting championships operated in Japan from 1997 to 2007 and used a rule set that would be illegal in every American athletic commission. In Pride, fighters were allowed to kick a grounded opponent in the head. They were allowed to stomp on a grounded opponent's head and body. They were allowed to knee a grounded opponent in the face. These techniques produced some of the most spectacular and most violent moments in MMA history. Wanderlei Silva's soccer kicks, Mirko Cro Cop's stomps, Shogun Rua's ground and pound with knees. Pride did not allow elbows on the ground, which is the opposite of the UFC's rules where elbows on the ground are legal. The different rule set meant that a fight in Pride and a fight in the UFC UFC were functionally different sports. Fighters who excelled in Pride's rule set sometimes struggled in the UFC and vice versa. One championship, which operates primarily in Asia, still allows knees to grounded opponents today, making it the closest modern equivalent to Pride's rule set. Championship rounds are not a rule. The fact that UFC main events are scheduled for 5 rounds instead of 3 is not a rule mandated by any athletic commission. It is a promotional policy chosen by the UFC. The unified rules allow bouts to be scheduled for either 3 or 5 rounds at the promoter's discretion. The UFC typically schedules main events and title fights for 5 rounds and all other bouts for 3 rounds, but there is no regulatory requirement to do so. Some fans and fighters have questioned why co-main event fights between ranked contenders are only scheduled for 3 rounds when the stakes of those fights are often comparable to main events. The UFC has occasionally scheduled non-title 5-round fights as main events, including bouts between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, which were non-title welterweight fights contested over 5 rounds purely because of their promotional significance. Open scoring has been tested. In most UFC events, fighters have no idea how the judges have scored the fight until the final decision is read after the bout is over. This means a fighter could be losing on all 3 scorecards heading into the final round and not know it. They might coast when they should be pushing for a finish. They might take unnecessary risks when they are actually winning. Some athletic commissions have experimented with open scoring, where judges' scores are announced after each round so that fighters and their corners know exactly where they stand. Commissions in South Korea, Singapore, and some Canadian provinces have tested this approach. Most American commissions have not adopted open scoring, and the UFC has not pushed for it. The argument against open scoring is that a fighter who knows they are ahead might fight more conservatively in the final rounds, leading to less exciting fights. The argument in favor is that fighters deserve to know whether they are winning or losing their own fight. The unified rules are not actually unified. Despite being called the unified rules of mixed martial arts, the rules are not applied uniformly across all jurisdictions. Each state athletic commission in the United States adopts and enforces the rules independently. When the rules were updated in 2017 to change the grounded fighter definition and other provisions, some states adopted the changes immediately while others took months or years to implement them. This meant that a fight taking place in Nevada might be governed by different rules than a fight taking place in New York on the same weekend. The inconsistency has created confusion for fighters, coaches, and referees who have to check which version of the rules applies in each jurisdiction before every event. International commissions add another layer of complexity since countries outside the United States may use their own variations of the unified rules or different rule sets entirely. Fighters must have a corner. Under the unified rules, a fighter cannot enter the cage without at least one licensed corner person. This rule exists to ensure that every fighter has someone in their corner who can provide medical assessment, strategic advice, and the ability to stop the fight if necessary. It has caused problems when fighters have fallen out with their coaches close to fight night. If a fighter fires their entire coaching staff during fight week, they still need to find a licensed corner person before the athletic commission will allow them to compete. In practice, promotions and commissions will help arrange a corner person if a fighter shows up without one. But the rule exists, and it means that no matter how independent a fighter believes they are, they cannot legally compete in a sanctioned MMA bout entirely alone. Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier's biggest weakness is his addiction to the guillotine choke. It has cost him the biggest fights of his career. Against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 242 in September 2019, Poirier was being taken down, and instead of focusing on getting back to his feet, he went for a guillotine attempt that failed and gave Khabib full mount. Khabib submitted him in the 3rd round. Against Charles Oliveira at UFC 269 in December 2021, Poirier was winning the fight on the scorecards heading into the 3rd round. Oliveira shot for a takedown, and Poirier locked up a guillotine instead of sprawling. The choke was not tight enough. Oliveira escaped, took Poirier's back, and submitted him. Against Islam Makhachev at UFC 302 in June 2024, the exact same thing happened. Poirier went for a guillotine from a bad position. It failed, and Makhachev used the scramble to take control and eventually submit him. 3 title fights, 3 guillotine attempts, 3 losses. The most frustrating part is that Poirier is one of the best boxers in the lightweight division, and his path to victory in all 3 fights was on the feet. The guillotine is a low percentage submission from bottom position against elite grapplers, and Poirier keeps going for it at the worst possible times. Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje was a Division I All-American wrestler at the University of Northern Colorado. He is one of the most credentialed grapplers in the lightweight division, and he almost never wrestles in MMA. Gaethje has made a career out of standing in the pocket and trading punches with anyone who will stand in front of him. He absorbs 7.58 significant strikes per minute, one of the highest rates in UFC lightweight history. His fights are violent and entertaining, and he has earned more post-fight bonuses than almost anyone on the roster. But his refusal to use his wrestling has cost him in every major fight he has lost. Against Khabib at UFC 254 in October 2020, he was choked unconscious in the 2nd round without ever attempting a takedown of his own. Against Dustin Poirier at UFC 291 in July 2023, he stood in the pocket and traded until Poirier knocked him out in the 2nd round. Against Max Holloway at UFC UFC 300 in April 2024, he was knocked out by a last-second walk-off punch after spending the entire fight trying to out-brawl a man who throws more punches than anyone in UFC history. Gaethje has the skills to fight a smarter fight. He simply chooses not to. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is the most powerful puncher in UFC featherweight and lightweight history when the fight is in the first 2 rounds. After that, his cardio betrays him. Against Nate Diaz at UFC 196 in March 2016, McGregor was winning the fight until he gassed in the second round. His punches lost their power, his movement slowed, and Diaz submitted him. Against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 229 in October 2018, McGregor looked competitive in the first round, but by the third and fourth he had nothing left, and Khabib mauled him. Against Dustin Poirier at UFC 257 in January 2021, McGregor looked sharp in the first round, and then his lead leg was destroyed by calf kicks, and he had no base to generate power. Poirier finished him in the second. The pattern is always the same. McGregor starts fast, throws with enormous power, and if his opponent survives the early onslaught, the fight turns. His preparation has always been geared towards ending fights quickly, and when that does not work, he has no second gear. It is the one flaw that separates him from being the greatest lightweight ever, instead of the greatest lightweight entertainer ever. Ronda Rousey. Ronda Rousey's weakness was so fundamental that when it was finally exposed, the entire world saw it at the same time. She could not box. She had no head movement. She had no defense against straight punches. For most of her career, it did not matter because she was so dominant in the clinch and on the ground that nobody could keep her at range long enough to exploit it. Then Holly Holm did exactly that at UFC 193 in November 2015. Holm circled, jabbed, moved her head, and punished Rousey every time she lunged forward. The head kick that ended the fight was devastating, but it was the jab that broke Rousey's spirit long before it landed. After the Holm loss, Rousey was given over a year to improve her striking. She came back at UFC 207 in December 2016 against Amanda Nunes. Nunes hit her with straight right hands from the opening bell, and Rousey had no answer. She did not move her head. She did not try to clinch. She stood in front of Nunes with her hands down and got knocked out in 48 seconds. Her coaches failed her. Edmund Tarverdyan told her for years that her striking was elite, and she believed him. It was the biggest coaching failure in UFC history. Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson's weakness was his inability to accept that he was aging. He fought the same way at 38 that he had fought at 30, and his body could not keep up. Ferguson's style was built on cardio, durability, and an endless willingness to walk through punishment to land his own shots. He threw spinning elbows, rolling thunder kicks, and Darce chokes from positions that no other fighter would attempt. It worked brilliantly for a decade. He won 12 consecutive fights between 2013 and 2019 and was the interim UFC lightweight champion. Then the losses started. Justin Gaethje beat him senseless over 5 rounds at UFC 249 in May 2020. Charles Oliveira outpointed him. Beneil Dariush outpointed him. Michael Chandler knocked him out with a front kick that is still one of the most violent finishes in UFC history. Bobby Green submitted him. Nate Diaz outpointed him. Paddy Pimblett submitted him. Michael Chiesa submitted him. 8 consecutive losses, the UFC record. Ferguson never changed his approach because his approach was who he was. He refused to fight safe. He refused to wrestle. He refused to take a step backwards. That stubbornness made him great, and then it destroyed him. Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley had one of the most devastating right hands in the history of the welterweight division. He knocked out Robbie Lawler in the first round to win the title at UFC 201 in July 2016. He knocked out Darren Till. He nearly took Stephen Thompson's head off in 2 fights. But somewhere between winning the belt and losing it, Woodley stopped throwing. He would back up against the cage, load up the right hand, and then just stand there for minutes at a time. He would not jab, he would not kick, he would not wrestle even though he was an all-American wrestler at Missouri. He would just stand against the cage and wait for one punch. Kamaru Usman took the belt from him at UFC 235 in March 2019 by simply walking forward and outworking him for 25 minutes. Woodley threw barely anything. Then Gilbert Burns dominated him. Then Colby Covington dominated him. Then Vicente Luque knocked him out. 4 consecutive losses, each one worse than the last. The explosive fighter who had knocked Lawler unconscious in the first round turned into a man who was afraid to throw punches. Nobody has ever adequately explained why. BJ Penn. BJ Penn's weakness was that he could never decide who he wanted to be. He fought at featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, and even competed in an open-weight exhibition bout against Lyoto Machida. He won titles at lightweight and welterweight. He was the first non-Brazilian to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship at black belt level. His talent was generational, but he bounced between weight classes without ever committing to one division long enough to build a dynasty. He vacated the welterweight title after beating Matt Hughes at UFC 46 in January 2004 without ever defending it. He won the lightweight title and defended it 3 times before losing it to Frankie Edgar in a fight where his conditioning failed him. His body changed dramatically between camps. He would show up looking sharp at one weight and then look drained and sluggish at another, and then he could not stop coming back. He retired and came back. He retired again and came back again. His last 7 UFC fights were all losses. He went from being one of the 5 greatest fighters of his generation to being the name they gave to young prospects who needed a recognizable opponent on their record, Anderson Silva. Anderson Anderson Silva's weakness was the very thing that made him the most entertaining fighter in UFC history. He showboated, he dropped his hands, he stuck his chin out and dared opponents to hit him. He leaned back against the ropes like Muhammad Ali and made championship-level fighters whiff at air. It was mesmerizing when it worked, and it worked for 16 consecutive UFC fights over 7 years. Then it did not. At UFC 162 in July 2013 against Chris Weidman, Silva was doing his usual routine. Hands down, chin out, weaving in front of a man who had genuine knockout power. Weidman threw a left hook, and Silva did not move. The punch connected, and Silva went down. In the rematch at UFC 168 in December 2013, Silva threw a checked leg kick that snapped his shin in half. After that, the Silva who came back was never the same. He went 1-6 with 1 no contest in his final 7 UFC bouts. The showboating that had defined his peak became a liability when his reflexes slowed by even a fraction of a second. He was still the fastest middleweight in the octagon, but he was no longer fast enough to get away with putting his hands behind his back. Jon Jones. Jon Jones may be the most talented fighter who has ever lived. He won the UFC light heavyweight title at 23 years old, the youngest champion in UFC history. His reach, his creativity, his fight IQ, and his ability to adapt mid-fight are unmatched. His weakness has nothing to do with what happens inside the cage. Jon Jones cannot stop destroying himself outside of it. In April 2015, he was involved in a hit-and-run accident where he crashed into a pregnant woman's car, fled the scene, came back only to grab cash, and fled again. He was stripped of the light heavyweight title. In July 2017, his knockout victory over Daniel Cormier at UFC 214 was overturned to a no contest after he tested positive for turinabol, a banned anabolic steroid. He was suspended for 15 months. In September 2021, he was arrested in Las Vegas for misdemeanor domestic violence and felony injuring a police vehicle. He has had multiple other legal issues including DUI arrests and failed drug tests. The result is that a fighter who should have the greatest resume in the history of the sport has spent years on the sidelines due to his own decisions. He has fought just once since 2020. The talent was always there. The discipline never was. Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz does one thing. He walks forward, throws volume combinations from a high guard, and dares his opponent to stand in front of him. When it works, it is one of the most entertaining styles in MMA. When it does not work, he loses and there is nothing else. His record is 21-13. He has never attempted to add wrestling to his offensive game, even though his brother Nick was a reasonably competent grappler. He has no leg kicks. He does not change levels. He does not cut angles. Against elite wrestlers like Benson Henderson, Josh Thompson, and Rafael dos Anjos, Diaz was taken down repeatedly and had no answer. His loss to Henderson at UFC on Fox 5 in December 2012 was a perfect example of what happens when a fighter cannot wrestle and fights a man who can. Henderson controlled him for 5 rounds. Diaz's durability and toughness have kept him competitive against almost everyone he has faced, but his ceiling was always limited by his refusal to evolve. Jorge Masvidal. Jorge Masvidal is one of the most exciting fighters outside of title contention and one of the most disappointing fighters inside it. His flying knee knockout of Ben Askren in 5 seconds at UFC 239 in July 2019 is the fastest knockout in UFC history. His 3-round demolition of Nate Diaz at UFC 244 in November 2019 showed he could fight a disciplined technical fight when he wanted to. But when the welterweight title was on the line against Kamaru Usman, Masvidal disappeared. At UFC 251 in July 2020 on short notice, he was outworked for 5 rounds and lost a clear unanimous decision. At UFC 261 in April 2021 with a full training camp, Usman knocked him out cold with a straight right hand in the second round. 2 title shots, 2 losses, and in neither fight did Masvidal look like the same man who had been knocking people unconscious on the undercard. His weakness is that he fights to survive in big moments instead of fighting to win. Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya is one of the most technically gifted strikers in MMA history. His counter-striking, his timing, and his ability to read opponents made him look unbeatable for years. His weakness is that he cannot handle sustained pressure from fighters who are willing to walk into his range and stay there. Sean Strickland proved this at UFC 293 in September 2023 by marching forward with a high guard for 5 rounds and winning a dominant unanimous decision. Alex Pereira proved it twice in kickboxing and once in MMA by walking through Adesanya's shots and landing bigger ones of his own. Dricus du Plessis proved it at UFC 305 in August 2024 by refusing to give Adesanya space to operate. The pattern is clear. When opponents stand at range and try to counter Adesanya, he picks them apart. When they push forward with volume and refuse to respect his power, his output drops, his movement becomes tentative, and he loses rounds without throwing. Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat Chimaev burst into the UFC with 4 wins in 66 days and looked like the most terrifying prospect the sport had ever seen. His wrestling was suffocating. His striking was powerful. He seemed destined for a title shot within his first year. Then his body failed him. He contracted COVID-19 in late 2020, and the complications lingered for months. He was out of action for over a year. When he returned, he was still dominant, but his weight cutting became a serious problem. At UFC 279 in September 2022, he weighed in at 178.5 pounds for a welterweight fight. He had missed weight by 7.5 pounds. The entire card had to be reshuffled. Chimaev fought Kevin Holland at a catchweight instead of Nate Diaz in the main event. He has since moved to middleweight, but the lingering question is whether his body can handle the demands of being a two-division threat. His talent is undeniable. His durability is the question mark. Derrick Lewis. Derrick Lewis has the most knockouts in UFC history with 16. He is the most dangerous puncher the heavyweight division has ever produced. His weakness is so obvious that it barely needs stating. He cannot fight past the second round. When a fight goes long, Lewis falls apart. His hands drop. His feet stop moving. His output declines to almost nothing. Against Cyril Gane at UFC 265 in August 2021, Lewis was knocked out in the third round after fading badly. Against Sergey Pavlovich at UFC 277 in July 2022, he was stopped in the first round when Pavlovich overwhelmed him with volume. Against Jailton Almeida at UFC on ESPN in November 2023, he was submitted in the first round after being taken down and having no energy to get back up. Lewis knows his weakness. His opponents know his weakness. The entire heavyweight division knows that if you survive the first 5 minutes against Derrick Lewis, you will probably win. And yet he has still knocked out more men than anyone in UFC history because when that right hand lands, the fight is over regardless of conditioning. Tai Tuivasa. Tai Tuivasa's career can be split into two halves. In the first half, he went on a 5-fight knockout streak that included finishes over Derrick Lewis, Greg Hardy, Augusto Sakai, Harry Hunsucker, and Stefan Struve. During that run, he was the most exciting heavyweight on the roster, and the shoey celebrations after each win made him a fan favorite. Then opponents started surviving the first round, and Tuivasa had nothing else to offer. He lost 4 consecutive fights to Alexander Volkov, Cyril Gane, Marcin Tybura, and Sergey Spivak. In each loss, the pattern was identical. Tuivasa threw everything he had early. His opponent survived, and then Tuivasa was gassed and either outpointed or finished in the later rounds. He has no wrestling. He has no clinch game. He has no jab. His entire approach is built around landing one enormous punch, and if that punch does not land, the fight is over for him in a different way. Paulo Costa. Paulo Costa looked like the most dangerous middleweight contender in the world when he knocked out Uriah Hall, Johnny Hendricks, and Yoel Romero in 3 consecutive fights between 2017 and 2019. He was a wall of muscle with heavy hands and relentless pressure. Then he fought Israel Adesanya for the middleweight title at UFC 253 in September 2020 and looked like a completely different person. He was sluggish from the opening bell. He could not close distance. He barely threw any strikes in the first round. Adesanya picked him apart with leg kicks and head strikes and stopped him in the second round. After the fight, it emerged that Costa had spent the night before the bout in the hospital, dealing with the effects of a brutal weight cut. He has struggled with his weight for his entire career. He missed weight at middleweight. He moved up to light heavyweight and looked undersized. He moved back down and still looked drained. His body was built to carry 215 pounds, and the sport kept asking him to make 185. Alex Pereira. Alex Pereira is a 2-division UFC champion and one of the most powerful strikers in MMA history. His weakness is the ground. When opponents take Pereira down, he has historically been vulnerable to submissions and ground and pound. Israel Adesanya recognized this in their rematch at UFC 287 in April 2023 and used feints and timing rather than wrestling to exploit Pereira's tendency to overcommit on his punches. At light heavyweight, Pereira has improved his takedown defense significantly. He stuffed multiple attempts from Jamahal Hill, Jiri Prochaska, and Khalil Roundtree. But the question remains whether an elite wrestler with size and top control could hold him down for 25 minutes. Nobody has tried it yet at 205 pounds. The ground game is still the one area of his skill set that has not been tested by the best grapplers in the division. And until it is, the question mark will remain. Dominick Cruz. Dominick Cruz is one of the most innovative fighters in UFC history. His footwork, his angles, and his ability to make opponents miss made him the greatest bantamweight of his era. His weakness was his body. Cruz tore his ACL in October 2012 and missed over 3 years of competition. He came back, won the bantamweight title from TJ Dillashaw at UFC on Fox 18 in January 2016, and then tore his ACL again. He was out for another 2 years. Between 2012 and 2020, Cruz fought just 4 times. He held the bantamweight title from 2010 to 2016, but defended it only twice in that 6-year span because he was almost always injured. 5 years of his prime were spent in rehabilitation. The bantamweight division moved on without him. Younger fighters adopted his style, improved on it, and surpassed him. When Cruz was healthy, he was arguably the best bantamweight who ever lived. He was almost never healthy. Cain Velasquez. Cain Velasquez is widely considered the best heavyweight in UFC history when he was healthy. He beat Brock Lesnar. He beat Antonio Silva. He beat Junior Dos Santos twice in brutal fashion. His combination of elite wrestling, relentless cardio, and heavy hands at 240 pounds was something the heavyweight division had never seen before. But Velasquez could not stay healthy long enough to build a legacy. Between 2013 and 2019, he fought just 6 times. Back injuries kept him out for over a year at a time. Knee injuries forced him to pull out of multiple bouts. He had surgery after surgery after surgery. When he did return, he was often not the same fighter. His final octagon appearance at UFC on ESPN1 in February 2019 was a 26-second knockout loss to Francis Ngannou. He had been inactive for over 2 years before that fight. Velasquez had the skills to be the greatest heavyweight of all time. His body would not allow it. Luke Rockhold was the UFC middleweight champion in June 2016. His combination of elite kickboxing, submission grappling, and physical size made him one of the most well-rounded fighters at 185 pounds. Then Michael Bisping caught him with a left hook and knocked him out in the first round at UFC 199. After that loss, Rockhold's chin was never the same. He was knocked out by David Branch at UFC Fight Night 116 in September 2017. He was knocked out by Yoel Romero at UFC 221 in February 2018 in one of the most violent finishes the middleweight division has ever seen. He moved up to light heavyweight and was knocked out by Jan Blachowicz at UFC 239 in July 2019. 4 knockout losses in his last 5 fights. The same fighter who had been dismantling opponents with technical precision for years was suddenly unable to absorb a clean punch without going down. Chin deterioration is one of the cruelest realities in combat sports. Once it goes, it does not come back. Kelvin Gastelum has the skills to compete with the best middleweights in the world. His boxing is sharp, his footwork is deceptive for his build. His fight against Israel Adesanya at UFC 236 in April 2019 is considered one of the greatest middleweight fights in history. His weakness is that he cannot make weight. He missed weight at welterweight by 9 pounds against Tyron Woodley at UFC 183 in January 2015 and was forced to move up to middleweight permanently. Then, at UFC Noche in September 2025, fighting at middleweight where the limit is 186 pounds, he missed weight again by over 5 pounds. He stands 5 feet 9 inches tall. His natural weight is closer to 200 pounds than to 170. His frame was never built for welterweight, and even a middleweight requires a significant cut. The weight issues have overshadowed his talent for his entire career. Alistair Overeem is one of the most talented heavyweights in MMA history. His K1 kickboxing was elite, his ground game was dangerous, his physical presence was terrifying. He had every tool a heavyweight fighter could ask for, except a chin. Overeem was knocked out by Stipe Miocic at UFC 203 in September 2016 after nearly finishing Miocic earlier in the fight. He was knocked out by Francis Ngannou at UFC 218 in December 2017 by a single uppercut that is still one of the most devastating punches ever thrown in the UFC. He was knocked out by Jairzinho Rozenstruik at UFC on ESPN7 in December 2019 with 4 seconds remaining in the 5th round after winning the entire fight. He was knocked out by Alexander Volkov at UFC Fight Night in February 2021 in his final bout. His career record includes numerous knockout losses across MMA, kickboxing, and mixed rules bouts. The talent was always there, but the chin was always the question. Charles Oliveira is one of the most dangerous finishers in UFC history, with 20 submission wins and the most finishes of any fighter in UFC history. His weakness is that he gets hurt in almost every single fight. Against Michael Chandler at UFC 262 in May 2021 for the vacant lightweight title, Oliveira was dropped badly in the first round and nearly finished. He came back and knocked Chandler out in the second. Against Dustin Poirier at UFC 269, he was rocked with punches in the first round before recovering and submitting Poirier in the third. Against Justin Gaethje at UFC 274, he was dropped in the first round by a right hand and looked like the fight could be stopped. He recovered and knocked Gaethje out. The pattern is consistent. Oliveira gets hit, gets hurt, survives on heart and toughness, and then finishes his opponent with either strikes or submissions. It has worked so far because his recovery and finishing instinct are supernatural. But getting dropped in every major fight is a habit that will eventually catch up with him against a fighter who does not give him time to recover. Robert Whittaker is one of the most skilled middleweights in UFC history, but he consistently loses the first round. Against Israel Adesanya at UFC 243 in October 2019, Whittaker was knocked out in the second round after losing the first. In the rematch at UFC 271 in February 2022, he lost a unanimous decision, and the first round was again clearly Adesanya's. Against Marvin Vettori at UFC Fight Night in September 2022, he lost the first round before coming back to win. Against Paulo Costa at UFC 298 in February 2024, he was on the back foot early before finding his rhythm in the second and third rounds. Whittaker is an elite fighter from round 2 onwards. His adjustments, his pace, and his ability to read opponents in the later rounds are world-class. But the slow starts mean he is always fighting from behind, and against championship-level opponents, those early rounds matter. In 5-round fights especially, giving away the first round is a luxury he cannot afford. Stipe Miocic was the greatest UFC heavyweight champion of all time, with 3 consecutive title defenses against Alistair Overeem, Junior Dos Santos, and Francis Ngannou. His wrestling, his boxing, and his ability to adjust mid-fight were elite for the division. His weakness was speed. When faster fighters forced the pace early and did not allow Miocic to settle into his rhythm, he was vulnerable. Daniel Cormier knocked him out with a right hook in the first round at UFC 226 in July 2018. Cormier was faster to the punch, and Miocic was not set when the shot landed. Francis Ngannou knocked him out in the second round at UFC 260 in March 2021, with a series of punches that Miocic could not get away from. Against Jones at UFC 295 in November 2023, Miocic was stopped in the third round after a long layoff and looked a step behind the entire fight. When Miocic could establish his jab, wrestle, and control the pace of the fight, he was nearly unbeatable. When his opponent set the pace for him, the results were very different. Royce Gracie versus Ken Shamrock. This is where it all started. November 12th, 1993, UFC 1 in Denver, Colorado. 8 men entered a tournament with no weight classes, no time limits, and almost no rules to determine which martial art was the most effective in a real fight. Royce Gracie was a 176-pound Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner who looked like he had no business being in a cage with anyone. Ken Shamrock was a 220-pound professional wrestler and submission fighter who looked like he had been built in a laboratory. They met in the semi-final. Gracie pulled guard, swept Shamrock, took his back, and choked him unconscious. It took less than a minute. Shamrock was humiliated. He had been submitted by a man who weighed 50 pounds less than him in front of the entire world. They were supposed to rematch at UFC 3, but Shamrock had to pull out with an injury. The rematch finally happened at UFC 5 in April 1995 in a 36-minute super fight. Neither man could finish the other. It went to a draw. The rivalry was never settled in the cage, but it did not need to be. Gracie and Shamrock created the template for every UFC rivalry that followed. The trash talk, the personal stakes, the feeling that two men genuinely wanted to hurt each other. Everything that came after this started here. Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock. Tito Ortiz was the UFC light heavyweight champion and the biggest star in the promotion when he started talking about Ken Shamrock in 2002. He called Shamrock old, slow, and washed up. He said Shamrock's time had passed and that he would prove it. Their first fight at UFC 40 in November 2002 drew one of the biggest pay-per-view audiences in UFC history at the time. Ortiz dominated from the opening bell and finished Shamrock with strikes in the third round. Then he performed his signature gravedigger celebration next to Shamrock's cornerman. Shamrock was furious. He demanded a rematch and got one at UFC 61 in July 2006. It lasted 1 minute and 18 seconds. Ortiz knocked Shamrock out cold. There was a third fight at UFC Fight Night in October 2006, and Ortiz won that one too by first round TKO. 3 fights, 3 Ortiz wins. Shamrock never got the victory he was looking for, and Ortiz never stopped rubbing it in. The rivalry mattered because it happened at a time when the UFC was still fighting for mainstream acceptance, and Ortiz versus Shamrock was the kind of personal beef that casual fans could understand and invest in. Tito Ortiz versus Chuck Liddell. Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell trained together at the Pit in Huntington Beach, California, under the same coaching staff. They were friends. Then the UFC offered them a fight against each other, and everything changed. Ortiz allegedly turned the fight down multiple times, claiming he did not want to fight his training partner. Liddell said Ortiz was ducking him. The tension built for years. They finally fought at UFC 47 in April 2004. Liddell knocked Ortiz out in the second round with a right hand. Ortiz demanded a rematch and got one at UFC 66 in December 2006. Liddell knocked him out again, this time in the third round. 2 fights, 2 knockouts, both by the same man. The rivalry defined the golden era of UFC marketing. Dana White used their personal history to sell both fights, and the buy rates proved that animosity between former friends was one of the most compelling stories the sport could tell. They fought a third time in 2018 under Golden Boy MMA, with Ortiz winning by first round TKO, but by that point both men were well past their primes and the fight was widely criticized for being sanctioned at all. Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell. Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell fought 3 times between 2003 and 2006 in a rivalry that defined the UFC light heavyweight division. Couture won the first fight at UFC 43 in June 2003 by TKO in the third round. He used his Greco-Roman wrestling to control Liddell against the cage and then finished him with strikes on the ground. It was a tactical masterclass from a man who was already being called too old for the sport. Liddell came back and knocked Couture out at UFC 52 in April 2005 with a right hand that put him face down on the canvas. It was one of the most brutal knockouts the division had ever seen. The rubber match happened at UFC 57 in February 2006, and Liddell won again, this time with a right hook that dropped Couture in the first round. The referee stopped it after follow-up strikes. 2 knockouts in a row for Liddell, and the trilogy was settled. What made this rivalry special was the respect. These 2 men never said a bad word about each other. There was no trash talk, no drama, no personal insults. They just fought at the highest level 3 times and let the results speak for themselves. Matt Hughes versus BJ Penn. Matt Hughes was the greatest welterweight in UFC history when BJ Penn Penn challenged him for the title at UFC 46 in January 2004. Hughes was 35-3 and had been champion since 2001. Penn was 6-1 with one draw, a jiu-jitsu prodigy from Hawaii who had only been fighting professionally for 3 years. Penn took Hughes back in the first round and locked in a rear naked choke. Hughes tapped at 4 minutes and 39 seconds. Penn was the new welterweight champion. Then Penn vacated the belt to chase the lightweight title and never defended it. Hughes won the belt back, and the two did not fight again until UFC 63 in September 2006, where Hughes won by TKO in the third round. The trilogy fight came at UFC 123 in November 2010, when Penn knocked Hughes out with strikes in the first round. The rivalry was 1-1 with a knockout each and a submission. It spanned 6 years and 2 different weight classes, and it never had a definitive ending because both men won when it mattered to them. Hughes owned the welterweight division. Penn was the more talented fighter. That argument was never resolved. Georges St-Pierre versus Matt Hughes. Georges St-Pierre fought Matt Hughes 3 times, and the arc of their rivalry tells the story of how the greatest welterweight of all time was built. The first fight at UFC 50 in October 2004 ended badly for GSP. Hughes took him down and submitted him with an armbar in the first round. It was only the second fight of GSP's UFC career, and he was not ready for Hughes wrestling. 2 years later at UFC 65 in November 2006, GSP was a completely different fighter. He knocked Hughes out with a left head kick followed by ground and pound in the second round to win the welterweight championship for the first time. The third fight at UFC 79 in December 2007 was the most dominant. GSP submitted Hughes with an armbar in the second round in a performance that showed the gap between them had become enormous. 3 fights, 3 different outcomes, and a complete transfer of power from one generation to the next. Hughes passed the torch whether he wanted to or not. Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen. Nobody had ever talked to Anderson Silva the way Chael Sonnen talked to him before their first fight at UFC 117 in August 2010. Sonnen called Silva a fraud. He mocked his striking. He questioned his toughness. He said Silva was scared to fight a real wrestler and that he would take him down and beat him up for 25 minutes. MMA had never seen trash talk at that level directed at a reigning champion. And then something remarkable happened. Sonnen went out and did exactly what he said he would. For 4.5 rounds, Sonnen controlled Silva on the ground. He took him down at will. He landed ground and pound. He was winning on all 3 scorecards. With less than 2 minutes remaining in the 5th round, Silva caught Sonnen's arm from his back and locked in a triangle armbar. Sonnen tapped. Silva won the fight with less than 2 minutes to go after being dominated for 23 minutes. It was the most dramatic comeback in UFC title fight history. The rematch at UFC 148 in July 2012 was different. Silva was more aggressive from the start. He hurt Sonnen with a knee in the second round and finished him with strikes. The trash talk that had made the rivalry legendary also ended it. Sonnen never got a third fight. Cain Velasquez versus Junior Dos Santos. The UFC heavyweight trilogy between Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos is one of the most violent chapters in the history of the sport. JDS knocked Velasquez out in 64 seconds at UFC on Fox 1 in November 2011 in the first ever UFC fight broadcast on network television. It was a perfect right hand that put Velasquez down, and the follow-up shots ended it immediately. Velasquez was supposed to be the best heavyweight in the world. JDS had just made him look like an amateur. The rematch at UFC 155 in December 2012 was the opposite. Velasquez came out with a completely different game plan and beat JDS for 5 rounds straight. He used his wrestling to control position, and then his cardio to overwhelm JDS with volume in the later rounds. JDS's face was unrecognizable by the final bell. The third fight at UFC 166 in October 2013 was the most brutal of the 3. Velasquez stopped JDS by TKO in the 5th round after nearly 25 minutes of sustained punishment. JDS had nothing left. His corner should have stopped it earlier. 2 out of 3 for Velasquez, but the damage those 3 fights inflicted on both men's bodies and careers was immense. Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. The rivalry between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier is the most personal in UFC history. They hated each other. It was not manufactured for the cameras or created to sell pay-per-views. They genuinely could not stand being in the same room. It started at a media event in August 2014 when they got into a brawl in the lobby of the MGM Grand Hotel. Security had to separate them. Jones pushed Cormier. Cormier swung. It made every sports news outlet in the country. Their first fight at UFC 182 in January 2015 was a 5-round war that Jones won by unanimous decision. Cormier had moments, but Jones' reach and creativity were too much. Then Jones was stripped of his title after the hit-and-run arrest, and Cormier became champion. They rematched at UFC 214 in July 2017, and Jones knocked Cormier out with a head kick in the 3rd round. It was devastating. Cormier was crying crying in the cage. He said he would never fight Jones again. Then the result was overturned to a no contest after Jones tested positive for Turnbull. Cormier got the belt back on a technicality. Jones never got a clean second win. The rivalry ended without resolution, and that is what makes it so painful. The most talented fighter of his generation could not stop sabotaging himself, and the most determined fighter of his generation could never beat him fairly. Ronda Rousey versus Miesha Tate. Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate fought twice and coached against each other on The Ultimate Fighter Season 18, and through all of it, they made it perfectly clear that they did not like each other. Their first fight was in Strikeforce in March 2012 for the Women's Bantamweight Championship. Rousey armbarred Tate in the first round. It was a nasty finish. Tate refused to tap for as long as possible, and her arm bent at a horrifying angle before the referee intervened. The TUF coaching stint in 2013 was tense from start to finish. They argued on camera. They insulted each other's training. It was uncomfortable television. The rematch at UFC 168 in December 2013 was better for Tate. She survived the first round and actually had some success in the second. But in the third round, Rousey got the armbar again. Tate tapped at 58 seconds. 2 fights, 2 armbar finishes, both by Rousey. The rivalry was one-sided in the cage, but it was essential for building women's MMA into what it became. Without Rousey versus Tate, there is no women's division in the UFC. Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz. The 2 fights between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz in 2016 were the biggest events in UFC history at the time. The first fight at UFC 196 in March saw Diaz submit McGregor by rear naked choke in the second round after McGregor gassed out trying to knock Diaz out at welterweight. The rematch at UFC 202 in August was a 5-round war. McGregor won the first 2 rounds with precision striking. Diaz rallied in the third. McGregor nearly finished Diaz with a knockdown in the fourth. The 5th round was back and forth chaos. McGregor won by majority decision. The second fight did 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. What made this rivalry work was the contrast. McGregor was the flashy, tailored suit-wearing Irish superstar who talked about being a king. Diaz was the Stockton kid in a hoodie who did not care about any of it. They brought out the best in each other inside the cage and the worst in each other outside of it. Water bottles were thrown. Insults were exchanged in every language both men spoke. A third fight has been discussed for years and has never happened. Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. This is the biggest rivalry the sport has ever produced. In April 2018, Conor McGregor and a group of associates attacked a bus carrying UFC fighters at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. Khabib Nurmagomedov was on that bus. McGregor threw a dolly through the window. Glass shattered. 2 fighters were injured and pulled from their bouts. McGregor was arrested and charged with assault. The entire incident was captured on camera and went viral. It became the most replayed moment in MMA history outside of an actual fight. The fight itself at UFC 229 on October 6, 2018, did 2.4 million pay-per-view buys, the most in UFC history. Khabib dominated from the start. He took McGregor down in the second round and mauled him. He submitted McGregor with a neck crank in the 4th round, and then the real chaos started. Khabib jumped over the cage and attacked McGregor's teammate Dylan Dennis. A brawl broke out between the 2 camps inside and outside the octagon. Khabib was suspended for 9 months and fined $500,000. McGregor was suspended for 6 months and fined $50,000. The rivalry crossed every line: religion, culture, nationalism, personal insults about family members. It was ugly and compelling in equal measure. Colby Covington versus Kamaru Usman. Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman were teammates at American Top Team in Coconut Creek, Florida, before they hated each other. They trained together. They sparred together. Then Covington started his heel persona, calling Usman a fraud and questioning his Nigerian heritage, and the personal relationship disintegrated. Their first fight at UFC 245 in December 2019 was one of the greatest welterweight fights ever. 5 rounds of sustained violence. Usman broke Covington's jaw in the 3rd round. Covington fought through it for 2 more rounds before Usman finished him with strikes in the final minute of the 5th. The rematch at UFC 268 in November 2021 was almost as good. 5 rounds again. Usman won by unanimous decision. Covington refused to accept the result and claimed the judges were corrupt. Whether the beef between them is real or manufactured for content is something only they know. But the fights were real, and both of them were willing to die in there, rather than give the other man the satisfaction of winning. Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor. Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor fought 3 times between 2014 and 2021, and the trilogy tells the story of 2 careers moving in opposite directions. The first fight at UFC 178 in September 2014 was at featherweight. McGregor was on the rise. He knocked Poirier out in the first round with a left hook and barely looked at him afterwards. It was dismissive. Poirier was devastated. devastated. He said that loss haunted him for years. 7 years later, they met again at UFC 257 in January 2021. This time, Poirier was the better fighter. He chopped McGregor's lead leg with calf kicks until McGregor could barely stand, then knocked him out with punches in the second round. The third fight at UFC 264 in July 2021 ended when McGregor snapped his tibia at the end of the first round. He fell awkwardly and the bone broke. Poirier won by doctor stoppage TKO. Between the fights, there was a charity controversy where McGregor had pledged $500,000 to Poirier's foundation and then refused to pay it. Poirier called him out publicly. McGregor threatened his family. It went from respectful rivalry to genuine animosity. Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. This is the greatest fight that never happened. Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov were booked to fight each other 5 separate times, and every single time the fight fell apart. The first booking was for the Ultimate Fighter Season 22 finale in December 2015. Khabib pulled out with a knee injury. The second was for UFC on Fox 19 in April 2016. Khabib pulled out again with another injury. The third was for UFC 209 in March 2017. This time it was Khabib who collapsed during his weight cut and had to be hospitalized. The fourth was the cruelest, UFC 223 in April 2018. Ferguson was in the best form of his life, riding a 10-fight win streak. 6 days before the fight, he tripped over a cable during a media obligation and tore his LCL. He was out. The fifth and final booking was for UFC 249 in April 2020. A global pandemic shut down international travel and Khabib could not leave Russia. Justin Gaethje replaced him and knocked Ferguson out in the 5th round, ending his win streak and beginning the worst losing run in UFC history. Ferguson and Khabib never fought. Two of the best lightweights who have ever lived never shared a cage. It is the greatest what-if in the history of the sport, and it will never be answered. Michael Bisping versus Luke Rockhold. Luke Rockhold and Michael Bisping did not like each other, and they did not pretend to. Their first fight at UFC Fight Night 55 in November 2014 was a dominant performance from Rockhold. He hurt Bisping with body kicks, took him down repeatedly, and finished him by TKO in the second round. After the fight, Rockhold said Bisping was not on his level and would never be a champion. Bisping remembered that. When Rockhold won the middleweight title from Chris Weidman at UFC 194, Bisping started calling for the rematch. Nobody took it seriously. But when Weidman pulled out of his rematch with Rockhold due to injury ahead of UFC 199 in June 2016, Bisping got the call on short notice. He was a massive underdog. Rockhold was expected to do exactly what he had done in the first fight. Instead, Bisping threw a left hook in the first round that caught Rockhold dropping his guard. Rockhold went down and Bisping finished him with follow-up strikes. Bisping was the UFC middleweight champion at 37 years old. He screamed at Rockhold's unconscious body and then turned to the camera and said he had told everyone this would happen. Nobody believed him. He did it anyway. The trilogy never happened, and Rockhold has called for it ever since. Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira have been fighting each other for 7 years across 2 different sports. Their first meeting was in kickboxing at Glory of Heroes 7 in April 2016. Pereira won by unanimous decision. Their second kickboxing fight was at Glory of Heroes 15 in March 2017. Pereira knocked Adesanya out cold with a left hook in the 3rd round. It was the first time Adesanya had ever been knocked out in any combat sport. Both men eventually transitioned to MMA and both ended up in the UFC's middleweight division. The UFC matched them for the middleweight championship at UFC 281 in November 2022 at Madison Square Garden in New York. Adesanya was winning the fight through 4 rounds. He was ahead on all 3 scorecards and appeared to be on his way to proving that MMA was different from kickboxing. Then in the 5th round, Pereira hurt him with a left hook, the same punch that had knocked him out in kickboxing. Pereira swarmed with strikes and the referee stopped the fight. Pereira was the new middleweight champion, and Adesanya had lost to the same man for the 3rd time. The 4th and final fight came at UFC 287 in April 2023 in Miami. Adesanya needed to win, and he did. He knocked Pereira out with a right hand in the 2nd round to reclaim the middleweight title. 1 and 3 became 1 and 1 in MMA. 4 fights across 7 years in 2 sports. Neither man has given a definitive answer about who is better. Both have a knockout of the other on their record. The rivalry may be over, but the argument never will be. Michael Bisping. Luke Rockhold was a minus 1100 favorite defending his UFC middleweight championship against Michael Bisping at UFC 199 on June 4, 2016. Bisping was a plus 525 underdog. Nobody expected Bisping to win. He was 37 years old. He had been fighting in the UFC since 2006 and had accumulated a record of 28-7. He had lost to almost every elite middleweight he had faced, including Rockhold himself, by 2nd round TKO at UFC Fight Night 55 less than 2 years earlier. Rockhold had dismantled him on the ground in that first fight, and there was no reason to believe the rematch would go any differently. But Bisping knew something no one else did. He knew that Rockhold had started to develop a habit of dropping his left hand when he threw his right. In the first round, Rockhold threw a lazy right hook, and Bisping countered with a short left hook that caught Rockhold flush on the chin. Rockhold's legs went and he dropped to the canvas. Bisping swarmed with follow-up shots and the referee stopped it. The arena erupted. Michael Bisping, the ultimate underdog, the man who had been fighting in the UFC for a decade without ever getting a title shot, was the UFC middleweight champion. He was the first British fighter to hold a UFC title. He cried on the microphone after the fight and thanked his family and every person who had ever told him he would never be champion. It remains one of the most emotional moments in UFC history. Brandon Moreno and Deiveson Figueiredo fought to a majority draw at UFC 256 in December 2020 in one of the best flyweight fights the UFC had ever seen. In the rematch 6 months later at UFC 263 on June 12, 2021, Moreno left no doubt. He was the sharper fighter from the opening bell. His combinations were cleaner, his movement was better, and his grappling was more aggressive than it had been in the first fight. In the third round, he took Figueiredo down, transitioned to mount, took his back, and locked in a rear naked choke. Figueiredo tapped at 4 minutes and 5 seconds, and Brandon Moreno became the first Mexico-born champion in UFC history. He broke down in tears in the octagon. His family rushed the cage. The Mexican flag was draped over his shoulders. For a country that had produced some of the greatest boxers in history, but never had a UFC champion, Moreno represented something bigger than a title. He had been cut from the UFC in 2018 after back-to-back losses. He went to fight on smaller shows, rebuilt his confidence, and earned his way back. 2 years after being released, he was a UFC champion. The rematch result was not an upset in the traditional sense because the odds were relatively close. But the story was an upset. Nobody thought Brandon Moreno, the fighter the UFC had cut, would ever hold a belt. He proved them all wrong. Juliana Peña. Amanda Nunes was a -700 favorite, defending both her bantamweight and featherweight titles heading into UFC 269 on December 11th, 2021. She had beaten Ronda Rousey in 48 seconds. She had beaten Chris Cyborg in 51 seconds. She had beaten Holly Holm, Valentina Shevchenko, Germaine de Randamie, and every other woman the UFC had put in front of her for the previous 5 years. She was the greatest female fighter in MMA history. Juliana Peña was a +500 underdog. She was known as the Venezuelan Vixen, a former Ultimate Fighter winner with a record of 11-4 who had never beaten anyone close to Nunes' level. Nobody took the matchup seriously. In the first round, Nunes looked like Nunes. She was landing heavy shots and hurting Peña with straight punches. But Peña kept coming forward. She ate the punches and pushed the pace. In the second round, Nunes started to fade. Her output dropped. Her movement slowed. Peña started landing combinations and then she pushed Nunes against the cage, dragged her to the ground, took her back and locked in a rear naked choke. Nunes tapped at 3 minutes and 26 seconds of round 2. The arena could not believe what had just happened. Neither could the commentators. Peña became the UFC bantamweight champion, and Nunes looked like a completely different fighter than the one who had been destroying everyone for half a decade. Nunes won the rematch at UFC 277 by unanimous decision, but the first fight stands as one of the most shocking results in UFC history. Leon Edwards. Kamaru Usman was winning. There was no debate about it. Heading into the 5th round of their welterweight championship fight at UFC 278 on August 20th, 2022, Usman was ahead on all 3 scorecards. He had dominated Leon Edwards with wrestling in the middle rounds and was on his way to a second consecutive victory over the British fighter after beating him by unanimous decision at UFC on Fox in December 2015. Edwards needed a finish and there was less than a minute left, 56 seconds remaining in round 5. Edwards threw a left head kick that caught Usman flush on the jaw. Usman's body went rigid. His arms locked at his sides and he fell backwards like a tree. Edwards hit him one more time on the ground before the referee jumped in. The knockout was so clean and so sudden that it took several seconds for the crowd at Vivint Arena in Salt Lake City to process what had happened. Leon Edwards was the UFC welterweight champion. He had been losing the fight for 24 minutes, and then he won it with one kick in the final 56 seconds. It was the greatest comeback in UFC championship history. Edwards went on to defend the belt against Usman in the trilogy at UFC 286, winning a clear, unanimous decision. But the head kick at UFC 278 is the moment that will be replayed forever. Sean Strickland. Israel Adesanya was a -675 favorite defending his UFC middleweight championship against Sean Strickland at UFC 293 on September 9th, 2023 in Sydney, Australia. Adesanya was considered one of the best strikers in MMA history. He had won the middleweight title twice and defended it multiple times with performances that ranged from dominant to spectacular. Strickland was a +500 underdog. He was known more for his controversial opinions and unfiltered trash talk than for his technical ability. Most analysts expected Adesanya to pick him apart from the outside with kicks and counters. That is not what happened. From the opening bell, Strickland walked forward with a high guard and a stiff jab. He pressured Adesanya relentlessly, cutting off the cage and refusing to let the champion settle into his rhythm. Adesanya could not find his range. His counters were not landing. His trademark precision was gone. Round after round, Strickland pushed forward with volume and Adesanya retreated without throwing back. When the final scorecards were read, all three judges scored the fight 49-46 for Strickland, meaning he had won 4 of the 5 rounds. Sean Strickland, the man nobody gave a chance, was the UFC middleweight champion. Adesanya has not held the title since. Miocic Tate. On the exact same card as McGregor and Diaz, March 5th, 2016, UFC 196 delivered another upset that most people have forgotten about. Holly Holm was the reigning women's bantamweight champion. She had just head-kicked Ronda Rousey unconscious 4 months earlier in one of the most iconic knockouts in UFC history. She was expected to beat Miocic Tate comfortably. Tate had been armbarred twice by Rousey and was considered a level below the champion. But Tate had other ideas. For 4 rounds, Holm controlled the fight with her jab and footwork. She was winning on all 3 scorecards heading into the 5th round. Then Tate shot a takedown against the cage, got Holm to the mat, took her back, and sank in a rear naked choke. Holm went unconscious at 3 minutes and 30 seconds of round 5. It was the kind of finish that only happens when a fighter refuses to accept they are losing. Tate was behind on every card and needed a finish. She got one. The cupcake was the UFC bantamweight champion. She would lose the belt in her very next fight to Amanda Nunes at UFC 200, but for that one moment at UFC 196, Miocic Tate reminded everyone that in MMA, 5 rounds is 5 rounds and no lead is safe until the final bell. Ilia Topuria. Alexander Volkanovski was the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, heading into UFC 298 on February 17, 2024, in Anaheim, California. He had held the featherweight title since December 2019 and had beaten Max Holloway twice, the Korean Zombie, Brian Ortega, and Yair Rodriguez in a run that many people considered the greatest title reign in featherweight history. Ilia Topuria was a 27-year-old Georgian-Spanish fighter with a record of 15-0 who had knocked out everyone in his path. He was not a traditional underdog in the betting sense because the odds were relatively close, but in terms of public perception, almost nobody believed that Topuria could actually beat Volkanovski. The champion was too experienced, too durable, and too smart. In the first round, Volkanovski was the busier fighter. He landed jabs and leg kicks and seemed to be settling into his rhythm. Then, in the second round, Topuria started landing power shots. A right hand stunned Volkanovski, then a left hook dropped him. Topuria followed up with ground and pound, and the referee stopped the fight. Ilia Topuria was the UFC featherweight champion. The pound-for-pound #1 fighter had been knocked out cold by a man most fans had dismissed as too small and too inexperienced to compete at that level. Topuria has not lost since. That is 12 upsets that changed the course of UFC history. Josh Barnett. In March 2002 at UFC 36, a 24-year-old Josh Barnett walked into the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas as a 12-1 underdog and walked out as the youngest UFC heavyweight champion in history. His opponent was Randy Couture, the Natural, a man who had already won the heavyweight title twice and was widely regarded as the most complete fighter in MMA. Couture was 10-3, a decorated wrestler with an iron chin and a game plan for every opponent. Barnett was supposed to be too young and too inexperienced to compete at that level. He was a catch wrestler with heavy hands and submission skills, but he had never faced anyone close to Couture's caliber. None of that mattered when the cage door closed. Barnett came out aggressive and pressured Couture from the opening bell. He hurt him with strikes and refused to let the veteran settle into his rhythm. In the second round, Barnett swarmed Couture with punches, and the referee stopped the fight at 4 minutes and 35 seconds. TKO, new champion. Barnett was stripped of the title 2 months later after testing positive for banned substances and never fought in the UFC again for over a decade. But for one night in Las Vegas, a 24-year-old kid did something nobody thought he could do. Matt Serra. UFC 69 in Houston, Texas, April 7, 2007. Georges St-Pierre was the UFC welterweight champion, a 13-1 fighter riding a 7-fight win streak with victories over BJ Penn, Matt Hughes, and Frank Trigg. He was a -1,300 favorite. That meant you had to bet $1,300 on GSP just to win 100. Matt Serra was on the other side of the cage. He was 9-4, a jiu-jitsu black belt from Long Island, who had won the Ultimate Fighter Season 4 to earn his title shot. The betting lines had Serra as an 11-1 underdog, the biggest in UFC title fight history at the time. Nobody gave him a chance. The fight started and GSP looked like GSP for about 90 seconds. He was moving well, feinting, controlling distance. Then Serra caught him with a right hand that wobbled him. GSP's legs went sideways and Serra swarmed. He threw wild hooks and uppercuts with both hands and GSP could not recover. He stumbled against the cage, tried to grab for a takedown, and Serra kept hitting him. Referee John McCarthy stopped it at 3 minutes and 25 seconds of the first round. The arena went silent. Matt Serra was the UFC welterweight champion. GSP went on to avenge avenged the loss at UFC 83, winning by TKO in the second round, and then reeled off 9 consecutive title defenses to become the greatest welterweight of all time. But that night in Houston belongs to Sarah. It is the single biggest upset in UFC championship history, and it always will be. Anderson Silva. For 7 years, Anderson Silva was untouchable. He won the UFC middleweight title at UFC 64 in October 2006 by TKO over Rich Franklin, and then defended it 10 consecutive times. He beat Franklin again, Dan Henderson, Forrest Griffin, Chael Sonnen, Vitor Belfort, and every other challenger the UFC put in front of him. His win streak reached 16 consecutive UFC victories, the longest in promotion history. His title reign lasted 2,457 days. He was the greatest fighter who had ever lived, and most people assumed he would retire without ever losing that belt. Then came Chris Weidman at UFC 162 on July 6, 2013. Weidman was 9-0, a Division I wrestler from Hofstra University with genuine power in his hands. But he was a massive underdog because it was Anderson Silva, and Anderson Silva did not lose. In the first round, Silva was clowning, dropping his hands, sticking his chin out, dodging punches with his hands behind his back. The crowd loved it because that was what Silva did. He made the best fighters in the world look foolish. In the second round, he did it again. He dropped his guard, leaned forward, and invited Weidman to hit him. Weidman threw a left hook that connected flush on Silva's jaw. Silva's legs buckled and he fell face first into the canvas. Weidman followed with hammer fists, and the fight was over. The 2,457-day reign was finished by the one thing everyone thought could never happen. Anderson Silva got caught showing off. Holly Holm. Ronda Rousey was a -2,000 favorite heading into UFC 193 on November 15, 2015. That meant the sportsbooks were saying there was roughly a 97% chance she would win. She had finished her last 3 opponents in a combined time of 64 seconds. She was the most famous female fighter on the planet. She was on the cover of magazines. She was in movies. She had armbarred or knocked out every single woman the UFC had put in front of her, and most people genuinely believed she was unbeatable. Holly Holm was a +900 underdog. She was a former boxing world champion who had transitioned to MMA relatively late in her career. She was 34 years old with a record of 9-0, but none of those 9 wins had come against anyone close to Rousey's level. The fight took place at Etihad Stadium in Melbourne, Australia, in front of 56,000 people. When the bell rang, Rousey did what she always did. She charged forward looking for the clinch. But Holmes circled away and snapped her head back with jabs. Every time Rousey lunged, Holmes sidestepped and cracked her with straight rights. Rousey had never been hit like that. She had never fought someone who could actually box. In the second round, Holmes backed up against the cage, waited for Rousey to charge in, and threw a left head kick that landed flush on the jaw. Rousey dropped face first and lay motionless on the canvas. The stoppage came at 59 seconds of round 2. The myth was dead. Rousey fought one more time after that. She lost to Amanda Nunes in 48 seconds at UFC 207 in December 2016 and was never seen in the octagon again. Nate Diaz. Conor McGregor was the UFC featherweight champion. He was the biggest star in the history of the sport. He had knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds to win the belt at UFC 194 and was riding a 15-fight win streak. At UFC 196 on March 5, 2016, he was supposed to fight Rafael dos Anjos for the lightweight title. When dos Anjos pulled out with a broken foot, Nate Diaz took the fight on 11 days' notice at a catch weight of 170 pounds. That was 2 full weight classes above where McGregor normally competed. It did not matter to the betting public. McGregor was still a significant favorite because he was Conor McGregor, and Nate Diaz was a career lightweight with a record of 19-10 who had lost 3 of his last 5 fights. The first round went according to script. McGregor hurt Diaz early with a left hand that opened a cut and wobbled him, but Diaz kept walking forward. He absorbed the punches and kept coming. By the second round, McGregor's shots had lost their snap. His mouth was open. His hands were dropping. Diaz started landing combinations and McGregor panicked. He shot a desperate takedown and Diaz stuffed it, took his back, and locked in a rear naked choke. McGregor tapped at 4 minutes and 12 seconds of round 2. The rematch, 5 months later at UFC 202, went to a majority decision for McGregor in one of the greatest fights the sport has ever seen. It did 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, but the first fight is the one that changed everything because it proved that Conor McGregor was human. Level 1. Level 1 is Tai Tuivasa. Tai Tuivasa's record is 14-9. 13 of his 14 wins have come by knockout. 1 came by unanimous decision over Andrei Arlovski at UFC 225, in a fight where Tuivasa showed that he can actually fight smart when he wants to. The problem is that he almost never wants to. Tuivasa has some of the heaviest hands in the UFC heavyweight division, but his approach to fighting almost never goes beyond loading up and swinging for a finish in the first round. When the knockout comes early, Tuivasa looks unstoppable. unstoppable. He flatlined Derrick Lewis with a single elbow. He knocked out Greg Hardy in the first round. He knocked out Stefan Struve, Augusto Sakai, and Harry Hunsucker, all inside the distance. But when the fight goes past the first 5 minutes, Tuivasa falls apart. His gas tank is one of the worst at heavyweight. By the second round, his hands start dropping, his movement slows down, and he begins eating shots he would have slipped 60 seconds into the fight. He's currently on a 6-fight losing streak, the longest in UFC heavyweight history. He lost to Cyril Gane because Gane used footwork and jabs to keep him at range for 3 rounds. He lost to Sergey Pavlovich by TKO in under a minute because Pavlovich pressured him before he could set his feet. He lost to Marcin Tybura by decision because Tybura survived the early storm and ground him down. He lost to Jairzinho Rosenstruck. He lost to Alexander Romanov by submission. He lost to Taliesin Teixeira at UFC 325 by unanimous decision. 6 fights in a row where his opponents figured out the same thing. Survived the first round and Tai Tuivasa beats himself. If he trained his cardio properly, managed his energy, and had any kind of backup plan for when the knockout doesn't come, he could be a legitimate top 10 heavyweight. Instead, he walks in with the same approach every single time. That is level 1 fight IQ. Dangerous power with no strategy behind it. Level 2. Level 2 is Justin Gaethje. Justin Gaethje is a 2-time Division I All-American wrestler from the University of Northern Colorado. He was the World Series of Fighting lightweight champion before joining the UFC. His credentials are elite. His leg kicks are some of the most damaging in the sport. His takedown defense is among the best in the lightweight division. He has genuine knockout power in both hands, and he almost never uses any of it intelligently. Gaethje's record is 26-5, and almost every single one of his fights follows the same pattern. He walks forward, he eats punches, he throws punches back. Whatever game plan his coaches gave him disappears within the first minute, and the fight turns into a brawl. Against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 254, he was supposed to use his wrestling background to keep the fight standing, and his leg kicks to limit Khabib's movement. Instead, he stood in front of one of the greatest grapplers in history, traded punches, and got submitted in the second round. Against Dustin Poirier at UFC 291, his coaches were telling him to use his wrestling, and he refused. He just kept swinging until Poirier knocked him out in the second round. Against Max Holloway at UFC 300 for the BMF title, he started well but abandoned his leg kicks and pressure as the fight went on, allowing Holloway to find his rhythm and knock him out in the final seconds of the 5th round with one of the most iconic knockouts in UFC history. Gaethje absorbs 7.58 significant strikes per minute, one of the highest rates in lightweight history. He gets hit clean constantly because he refuses to move his head or use angles. He walks through shots and throws his own back. It works often enough because his power is real and his toughness is extraordinary. But every loss on his record has come because he abandoned the smart approach in favor of a fight. That is level 2. The talent and the tools are clearly there. The discipline to use them properly is not. Level 3. Level 3 is Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz has a professional record of 21-13 across nearly 2 decades of fighting. His boxing fundamentals are excellent. His jiu-jitsu is elite with multiple submissions over high-level opponents. His cardio is bottomless and he can fight 5 rounds without slowing down. He has one of the best chins in the history of the lightweight division. He's never been afraid of anyone, regardless of size, ranking, or reputation. But nobody has ever called Nate Diaz a tactical genius. Diaz's approach to fighting has never changed across his entire career. He walks forward, throws volume, taunts his opponent, points at them, and dares them to stand and trade. There is no adjustment between rounds. There is no plan B. He fought the exact same way against Conor McGregor, as he did against Leon Edwards, as he did against Jorge Masvidal, as he did against Tony Ferguson, as he did against every single opponent he has ever faced. Sometimes it works because his skills are genuinely that good. He submitted Conor McGregor at UFC 196 with a rear naked choke because his jiu-jitsu is world-class, and McGregor gassed out trying to knock him out. He outboxed Gray Maynard. He put on striking clinics against Donald Cerrone and Jim Miller. But against wrestlers and pressure fighters, against anyone who refuses to play his game, Diaz has never had an answer. He lost to Benson Henderson, Rafael dos Anjos, and Josh Thompson because they all figured out that if you take Nate out of his preferred range and style, he has nothing else to offer. He won the Ultimate Fighter Season 5 and has been fighting professionally since 2004. In all that time, his approach has never evolved. You wouldn't call him dumb. He knows what he's good at. He just refuses to do anything else, and that has cost him fights he could have won if he had any willingness to adapt. That is level 3. Extremely skilled but completely locked into one approach regardless of the opponent. Level 4. Level 4 is Dustin Poirier. Dustin Poirier has a record of 30-10 with 1 no contest. He's beaten Conor McGregor twice, he's beaten Max Holloway, he's beaten Justin Gaethje, he's beaten Eddie Alvarez, Anthony Pettis, and Dan Hooker. He was the interim UFC lightweight champion. His boxing is among the best the lightweight division has ever seen, and his ability to adjust during a fight is genuinely impressive. Against McGregor in their second fight at UFC 257, Poirier targeted the calf with low kicks in the early rounds to destroy McGregor's mobility, then finished him in the second round when McGregor could no longer move. That's elite fight IQ. Against Gaethje at the Ultimate Fighter 25 finale, he weathered an early storm, adjusted his range, and stopped Gaethje in the fourth round. Against Dan Hooker at UFC Fight Night in June 2020, he survived a brutal first 2 rounds and came back to finish the fight in what many consider one of the best lightweight fights in UFC history. But Poirier has one glaring flaw that has haunted his entire career, and it is the perfect example of how even smart fighters can have blind spots: the guillotine choke. Dustin Poirier has 8 submission wins in his career, but 0 of them are by guillotine choke, not 1. Every single guillotine he has ever attempted in competition has failed. Against Khabib Nurmagomedov at UFC 242, Poirier locked up a deep guillotine in the third round that the entire arena thought was going to finish the fight. Khabib survived, passed to side control, and submitted Poirier minutes later. Against Islam Makhachev at UFC 302 for the undisputed lightweight championship, Poirier was competitive for 4 rounds. In the 5th round, instead of continuing to box from distance where he was having success, he jumped a guillotine. It failed. Makhachev ended up on top, transitioned to a Darce choke, and submitted him. It cost Poirier the lightweight title. Against Benoit Saint-Denis, he attempted 6 guillotines in a single fight, 3 standing, 3 jumping. All 6 failed. His coaches have spoken about it publicly. Everyone in MMA knows the guillotine is Poirier's blind spot because he cannot stop going for it even when it has never once worked. He even said publicly after the Makhachev loss that he would never stop jumping for the guillotine. That is a level 4 fight IQ. Smart enough to beat almost anyone in the world, but undermined by a single habit he refuses to break. Level 5. Level 5 is Alexander Volkanovski. Alexander Volkanovski's fight IQ is one of the main reasons he has been able to compete at the highest level of MMA for as long as he has. His record is 28-4, and he has 6 featherweight title fight wins across 2 separate reigns, tying Jose Aldo's all-time record. He's 37 years old, which is ancient for a featherweight. The reason he's still winning at that age is almost entirely because of how smart he is inside the octagon. The best example is the Max Holloway trilogy. Volkanovski beat Holloway 3 times in a row between 2019 and 2022. Not with power, not with wrestling, not with a single dominant weapon. He beat Holloway by outthinking him round by round. In the first fight, he used leg kicks and pressure to slow Holloway's output. In the second fight, he mixed counter-striking with volume to edge out a split decision. In the third fight, he came out more aggressively and took risks that Holloway wasn't expecting. 3 fights against the same elite opponent, and he used a different approach each time. Against Brian Ortega at UFC 266, Volkanovski got caught in 2 deep submission attempts, a guillotine choke and a mounted triangle. Either one could have ended the fight. He survived both through pure composure and technique. He didn't panic. He didn't abandon his game plan. He methodically worked his way out of both submissions and went back to picking Ortega apart. He won the 4th and 5th rounds after nearly being finished in the 3rd. Against the Korean Zombie at UFC 273, he designed a strategy that mixed pressure and volume so effectively that Chan Sung Jung had nothing left by the 4th round and was finished by TKO. This is a man who weighed 214 pounds as a rugby league player in Australia. He cut down to 145 to fight at featherweight. He came back from consecutive knockout losses to Islam Makhachev and Ilia Topuria to win the featherweight title for a second time at 36 years old. Every major achievement in his career has come from intelligence rather than pure physical gifts. That is level 5 fight IQ, the kind that extends your career by years and turns fights you should lose into victories. Level 6. Level 6 is Jon Jones. Jon Jones has the highest fight IQ in UFC history, and it is the single biggest reason why he is considered the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. His record is 28-1 with 1 no contest, and his only loss is a disqualification against Matt Hamill for illegal 12-6 elbows in a fight he was completely dominating. He has 16 title fight wins, more than any fighter in history, and the reason he kept winning for over a decade against every elite fighter in the world is that he could read read and adapt to any opponent in real time better than anyone who has ever competed in the sport. Against Mauricio Shogun Rua, he used reach and unorthodox angles to overwhelm a striker. Against Daniel Cormier, he used oblique kicks and front kicks to the body to neutralize a shorter, stronger wrestler. Against Alexander Gustafsson in their rematch, after their first fight was considered one of the greatest in UFC history, Jones abandoned the striking entirely, took Gustafsson down, and submitted him in the third round. Against Cyril Gane at heavyweight, a division he had never competed in before, he shot a takedown in the first round and submitted a man who had never been taken down in his UFC career. Against Glover Teixeira, he grabbed the wrist to land elbows. Against Vitor Belfort, he survived an early armbar by staying calm and working his way free. Every fight was different because Jones studied each opponent and designed a specific approach to exploit their weaknesses. The reason he's not level 7 is the cheating. Jones consistently used techniques that crossed the line between legal and illegal as part of his fight strategy. The extended fingers that led to constant eye-poke controversies against Daniel Cormier, Alexander Gustafsson, and multiple other opponents. The oblique kicks aimed directly at hyperextending opponents' knees. He would keep his fingers outstretched in opponents' faces to maintain distance, knowing that referees almost never deduct points for it. It's undeniably intelligent. Knowing exactly how much you can get away with is a form of fight IQ, but it crosses the line from pure intelligence into gamesmanship. That is level 6. The smartest fighter who has ever lived, kept from the top spot because a meaningful part of his intelligence was dedicated to figuring out how much he could cheat without getting punished for it. Level 7. Level 7 is Zabit Magomedsharipov. Zabit Magomedsharipov retired from the UFC in June 2022 with a professional record of 18-1 and a 6-0 record inside the octagon. He never fought for a title. He never got the chance. And that is one of the biggest tragedies in modern MMA, because the fight IQ this man showed across his 6 UFC appearances was unlike anything the sport has seen before or since. Zabit was born in Khasavyurt, Dagestan in 1991. At a young age, he was sent to the 5 directions of the world, a wushu boarding school where he lived for over 10 years and trained martial arts 3 times a day. He studied freestyle wrestling, combat sambo, sanda, and wushu. He competed internationally in sanda and won a medal at the European Wushu Championships. Before joining the UFC, he went 6-0 in Absolute Championship Berkut and became the ACB featherweight champion. By the time he reached the UFC, he had trained in more martial arts disciplines than most fighters even know exist, and he could use all of them seamlessly in the same fight. In his UFC debut against Mike Santiago, he submitted him with a rear naked choke in the second round and won a performance of the night bonus. Against Shayman Moraes, another submission win and another performance of the night bonus. Against Kyle Bochniak, he won a unanimous decision in a fight that earned fight of the night after 3 rounds of creative, intelligent striking that Bochniak had no answer for. Against Brandon Davis, he pulled off a modified knee bar submission in the second round, a technique almost nobody in the UFC had ever attempted in competition. Against Jeremy Stevens at UFC 235, one of the hardest hitters in featherweight history, Zabit completely neutralized his power by controlling range with kicks and feints that Stevens couldn't read. He mixed level changes, spinning attacks, and grappling threats so fluidly that Stevens spent 3 rounds guessing wrong about what was coming next. Against Calvin Kattar at UFC on ESPN in November 2019, he outboxed a pure boxer by mixing in wrestling threats that forced Kattar to worry about takedowns while getting hit with strikes he never saw coming. He won all 6 of his UFC fights. He earned 4 bonuses in 6 appearances. What made Zabit's fight IQ so special was that he never relied on a single weapon. He never fell into patterns. He was never predictable. He would use techniques that no other fighter in the UFC would even attempt, spinning hook kicks from the clinch, jumping switch kicks, knee bar attempts from bottom position, and he would land them because every setup was so intelligent that the opponent never saw it coming. Every round he fought looked different from the one before, because he was constantly reading what his opponent was showing him and adjusting in real time. He was ranked number 3 in the featherweight division when he was removed from the rankings due to inactivity in April 2021. He had been trying to get a fight booked against Yair Rodriguez for years, but Rodriguez pulled out twice, first from UFC 228 in September 2018, and again from UFC Fight Night 175 in August 2020. Zabit developed serious health issues related to his immune system that required surgery. The surgery was career-threatening. By 2022, 2022, after nearly 3 years without a fight and ongoing health problems, he notified the UFC that he was retiring. He walked away at 31 years old to coach his younger brother Kassan, who is now fighting professionally. That is level 7 fight IQ. A fighter so intelligent, so creative, and so technically complete that every opponent he faced in the UFC looked like they were solving a puzzle they had never seen before. He mastered more martial arts than most people can name. He combined them in ways nobody had seen. He was climbing through the featherweight rankings faster than anyone and was heading straight for a title shot, and then his body failed him. We never got to see what Zabit Magomedsharipov would have become with a belt on the line. That's the tragedy. The smartest and most creative fighter of his generation retired before the world got to see the full picture. Level 1. Level 1 is Bo Nickal. Nickal is a 3-time NCAA Division I wrestling champion from Penn State, one of the most dominant collegiate wrestlers in American history, and one of the most hyped prospects the UFC has ever signed. His wrestling is genuinely elite. On the mat, he's as good as anyone who has ever competed in MMA. The problem is that's basically all he has right now. Nickal's striking is still developing. His boxing is stiff, his footwork is limited, and when he's forced to fight on the feet for extended periods, he looks uncomfortable. He hasn't faced a truly elite striker in the UFC yet, and the concerns about what happens when someone can stuff his takedowns and force him to box are legitimate. His record is 8-1, and his only loss came against someone who could keep the fight standing. Nickal is still early in his career, and he could absolutely develop into a more complete fighter over time. But right now, at this stage, he's a wrestler who happens to fight in MMA rather than a true mixed martial artist. His success depends almost entirely on getting the fight to the ground. If the takedown lands, he's one of the most dangerous guys in the middleweight division. If it doesn't, there are serious questions. That's level 1. You're elite at one thing, and that one thing is so good that it carries you. But you're not a mixed martial artist yet. You're a specialist fighting in a mixed martial arts cage. Level 2. Level 2 is Derrick Lewis. The Black Beast is the most prolific knockout artist in UFC heavyweight history with over 14 knockouts in the organization. When his right hand lands clean, the fight is over. Nobody at heavyweight can afford to get hit by Derrick Lewis, but that's basically his entire game. Lewis's grappling defense is poor. When fighters take him down, he struggles to get back to his feet. His cardio disappears after the first round and a half. His wrestling is non-existent offensively. His kicking game is minimal. His footwork is flat. He doesn't move his head. He stands in front of you and throws bombs until either you go down or he gasses out. Against elite grapplers, Lewis gets dominated. Daniel Cormier took him down and controlled him for 5 rounds. Cyril Gane picked him apart from the outside. Sergey Pavlovich knocked him out because Lewis couldn't deal with Pavlovich's speed. Lewis has more tools than a pure one-dimensional fighter because his knockout power is complemented by decent enough boxing to set it up. He has a basic jab, he understands range for a heavyweight, and his power is legitimate from either hand. But compared to level 1, the difference is that Lewis has been in the UFC for over a decade, and this is as complete as he's going to get. He's not developing new skills. This is the finished product. 2 tricks. You need a knockout power and enough toughness to survive until the right hand lands. That's level 2. You've got one elite weapon and just enough around it to stay dangerous. But any fighter who neutralizes that one weapon exposes everything you're missing. Level 3. Level 3 is Michael Bisping. Bisping is a former UFC middleweight champion, a Hall of Famer, and one of the most underrated fighters in UFC history. He was never the most talented guy in the room. His boxing was good but not elite. Then his wrestling was decent but not dominant. His kicks were there but nothing special. His grappling was functional but he was never submitting anyone. Bisping was the definition of a competent all-rounder. He could stand with strikers and not get embarrassed. He could grapple with wrestlers and not get completely dominated. He could survive on the ground with jiu-jitsu guys and work his way back to the feet. Nothing about Bisping was spectacular, but nothing about him was exploitable either. Yeah, he won the middleweight title by knocking out Luke Rockhold, a guy who was better than him on paper in almost every area. But Bisping's well-roundedness meant he was never in a position where he was completely out of his depth. He could compete with anyone because he had something for every situation. His cardio was excellent, his toughness was legendary, and his fight IQ allowed him to use his decent skills across every area to outwork specialists who were better than him in one discipline. Yeah, but that's level 3. You're not elite anywhere, but you're competent everywhere. You don't have a hole in your game because your game is built on being good enough at everything to survive and outwork people who are better than you at specific things. Level 4. Level 4 is Dustin Poirier. Poirier is one of the most complete fighters the lightweight division has ever seen. His boxing is elite. We already covered that in the boxing script. But what makes Poirier level 4 on the mixed martial artist scale is that he's not just a boxer. He's a genuinely well-rounded fighter who can compete everywhere. His guillotine choke is one of the best in the UFC. He's submitted multiple opponents off his back when they thought they were winning the grappling exchanges. His clinch work is underrated. He throws devastating knees and elbows in close range. His defensive wrestling has improved dramatically over his career. He went from getting taken down easily in his early career to stuffing takedowns from some of the best wrestlers in the division. Against Khabib Nurmagomedov, the most dominant grappler in lightweight history, Poirier survived on the ground far longer than most fighters did, and even threatened with a guillotine that had Khabib in real trouble. Against Conor McGregor, he showed he could box with the best striker in the division and knock him out. Against Justin Gaethje, he showed he could survive a war and come out on top. The difference between level 4 and the levels above is that Poirier's wrestling and grappling, while much improved, are still the weakest part of his game. He's primarily a striker who has developed enough grappling to survive and occasionally threaten. He's not initiating takedowns. He's not controlling fighters on the ground offensively. His game starts and ends with his hands, and everything else is built around supporting that. That's level 4. You're elite at your primary weapon and legitimately good at everything else. There are no massive holes in your game, but there's a clear hierarchy in your skills. Level 5. Level 5 is Robert Whittaker. Whittaker is one of the most complete fighters the middleweight division has ever produced. He started his career as a wrestler on The Ultimate Fighter and has since developed into a fighter who can genuinely compete at an elite level in every phase of the fight. His striking is technical and powerful. He has knockout power in both hands, he uses kicks effectively to manage distance, and his timing on counters is excellent. He knocked out Ronaldo Jacare Souza, a legendary grappler, with strikes. He knocked out Darren Till with a head kick elbow combination that showed creativity and precision. His wrestling is elite. He can take people down when he needs to, and his takedown defense against wrestlers is outstanding. And he stuffed Yoel Romero's takedowns across 2 5-round wars. He defended against Robert Whittaker's scrambles with ease. His grappling off his back is solid enough that he's never been submitted in the UFC. The thing about Whittaker is that he doesn't just have skills in every area, he transitions between them seamlessly. He'll start an exchange with strikes, blend in a takedown attempt, work from top position, and if the opponent gets up, he's right back to striking without missing a beat. The transitions are what separate level 5 from level 4. It's not just having multiple skills, it's being able to flow between them in real time based on what the fight demands. That's level 5. You're elite in multiple disciplines and you can switch between them mid-fight without losing effectiveness. You're a true mixed martial artist who is dangerous everywhere. Level 6. Level 6 is Georges St-Pierre. GSP is widely considered the most well-rounded fighter in MMA history. He held a 3rd-degree black belt in Kyokushin Karate, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and despite having no competitive wrestling background before MMA, he landed more takedowns than any fighter in UFC history with 90. That stat alone tells you everything about GSP as a mixed martial artist. He took a skill he didn't grow up with, learned it from scratch, and became the best in the world at it inside the octagon. GSP's striking was crisp and technical. His jab was one of the best in UFC history. He used Superman punches, spinning back kicks, and head kicks with precision and timing. He knocked out Matt Hughes with a head kick. He outstruck BJ Penn on the feet. He went toe-to-toe with elite strikers and held his own every single time. His wrestling was dominant. He took down the best wrestlers in the welterweight division at will. Josh Koscheck, an Olympic-level wrestler, couldn't stop GSP's takedowns. Neither could Matt Hughes, one of the greatest wrestlers in MMA history. GSP made elite wrestlers look like amateurs. What separates GSP from everyone below him is that he didn't just have skills everywhere. He was elite everywhere. Not good, not competent, elite. His striking was championship level. His wrestling was the best in the division. His submissions were effective against world-class grapplers, and he could game plan and adjust mid-fight better than anyone in the sport. That's level 6. Elite at everything, no weaknesses, the blueprint for what a true mixed martial artist should look like. Level 7. Level 7 is Jon Jones. Jon Jones is the most complete mixed martial artist the sport has ever seen, and the argument isn't even close. He has a 28-1 record with 1 disqualification loss that most people agree shouldn't count. He's a former light heavyweight champion who defended his belt more times than anyone in the division's history, and he moved up to heavyweight and won that title as well. Jones's striking is unique and devastating. He uses his 84.5-inch reach, the longest in UFC history, to throw techniques from angles nobody else can access. His elbows are some of the most dangerous weapons in the sport. Now, he broke Alexander Gustafsson down with elbows. He cut open Brandon Smith's face with spinning elbows. His wrestling is elite. He was a junior college national champion before entering MMA, and he's used that wrestling to control every fighter he's ever faced. He took down Daniel Cormier, an Olympic wrestler, multiple times across 2 fights, and he controlled Glover Teixeira on the ground. He ragdolled fighters who were supposed to be grappling threats. His submissions are legitimate. He submitted Lyoto Machida with a standing guillotine choke. He submitted Daniel Cormier with an arm triangle. He submitted defeated Cyril Gane with a guillotine at heavyweight. He can finish fights on the ground. But what truly makes Jones level 7 is his fight IQ. He reads opponents in real time. He adjusts between rounds. He finds weaknesses that nobody else sees and exploits them with techniques from whatever discipline is needed. Against a striker, he wrestles. Against a wrestler, he strikes. Against a complete fighter, he does whatever they're worst at and forces them into their weakest position. Nobody in UFC history has been able to handle Jones in any phase of the fight. These strikers can't outstrike him. Wrestlers can't outwrestle him. Grapplers can't submit him. That's level 7, the perfect mixed martial artist. The fighter who does everything better than the specialists who dedicate their entire career to one discipline. Jon Jones is the most complete fighter MMA has ever produced, and nobody who has stepped into the cage with him has found an answer. Level 1. Level 1 is Alistair Overeem. Overeem is one of the most talented heavyweight fighters in combat sports history. He's a former K1 Grand Prix champion, a Strikeforce heavyweight champion, and he competed at the highest levels of the UFC for nearly a decade. The man has knockout power, elite kickboxing, a dangerous guillotine choke, and legitimate finishing ability everywhere, but his chin is made of glass. Overeem has been knocked out over a dozen times across his MMA and kickboxing career. In the UFC alone, he was finished by strikes by Stipe Miocic, Francis Ngannou, Jairzinho Rozenstruik, Alexander Volkov, and Curtis Blades. The Ngannou knockout at UFC 218 is one of the most violent finishes in UFC history. Ngannou threw a single uppercut that sent Overeem's body flying backward, like he'd been hit by a truck, but his lip was split open so badly that it was hanging off his face. And the worst part is that Overeem was actually winning that fight before the knockout. That's the story of his entire career. He could be dominating a fight, landing clean shots, controlling the pace, and then one punch changes everything. His chin just couldn't take it. Overeem absorbed 4.23 significant strikes per minute throughout his UFC career, which isn't even that high for a heavyweight. He just couldn't take clean shots the way other heavyweights could. One clean punch, and the lights went out. Every single time. That's level 1. You have all the talent in the world, but your chin is so fragile that it doesn't matter. One clean shot and everything you've built in a fight disappears. Level 2. Level 2 is Luke Rockhold. Rockhold is a former UFC middleweight champion, a former Strikeforce champion, and one of the most physically gifted fighters the middleweight division has ever seen. His kicks are devastating, his grappling is world-class, and when he's on top of you, he's one of the best ground-and-pound fighters in the sport, but his chin betrayed him at the worst possible moments. The first time was against Michael Bisping at UFC 199. Rockhold was the champion. He was the heavy favorite. He was supposed to cruise through Bisping and defend his belt, but in the first round, Bisping caught him with a left hook while Rockhold's chin was up in the air and it was over. Rockhold was out cold. The belt was gone. Then came Yoel Romero at UFC 221. Romero hit him with an overhand left in the third round that sent Rockhold crashing to the canvas. Another devastating knockout. Then came Jan Blachowicz at UFC 239. Rockhold moved up to light heavyweight and got knocked out again in the second round with a clean left hook. 3 knockout losses in 4 fights, all from single punches that landed on an exposed chin. The pattern was always the same. Rockhold would leave his chin elevated, his hands low, and someone would crack him with a single clean shot. His chin wasn't glass like Overeem's. He could take some punishment, but when a clean power shot landed on his jaw, he went down every single time. That's level 2. Your chin can handle some work, but clean power shots shut you off consistently. Level 3. Level 3 is Robert Whittaker. Whittaker is one of the toughest fighters in UFC middleweight history. Now, he's a former champion who fought the most dangerous guys in the division for over a decade. His chin is respectable. He can take shots. He's survived wars against Yoel Romero twice, and Romero is one of the hardest hitters the middleweight division has ever seen. In their first fight, Romero dropped Whittaker and nearly finished him, but Whittaker recovered and came back to win the decision. In their second fight, Romero hit him with a head kick that would have knocked out most middleweights, and Whittaker survived it and kept fighting. But here's where level 3 shows its ceiling. Against Israel Adesanya, Whittaker got dropped and finished in the second round. Against Dricus du Plessis, he got stopped. Against Khamzat Chimaev, he got submitted after being hurt on the feet. Whittaker's chin can handle a lot, but elite power punchers and precise strikers have consistently found a way to hurt him. He's been dropped in multiple fights. He gets buzzed more often than someone at levels above him. He recovers well, which is why he's level 3 and not lower. His recovery is actually elite, but getting hurt in the first place puts him at this level. That's level 3. A good chin that takes punishment and recovers well, but gets cracked by the truly elite power punchers. Level 4. Level 4 is Justin Gaethje. Gaethje is one of the most violent fighters in UFC history, and his chin is a massive part of how he fights. He absorbs 7.66 significant strikes per minute, one of the highest rates in the entire UFC. That's an insane number. To put that in perspective, most fighters try to avoid getting hit. Gaethje walks into punches on purpose because his chin allows him to. He eats shots to land his own. He trades willingly in the pocket against the hardest hitters in the lightweight division because he trusts his chin to hold up. Against Michael Chandler, Gaethje took bombs that would have knocked out any normal lightweight and kept kept walking forward throwing his own. Against Dustin Poirier, he absorbed clean shots for 4 rounds before finally getting stopped. Against Tony Ferguson, he was getting hit clean and kept coming forward until he broke Ferguson down. Gaethje has been knocked out, but only by Poirier and by Eddie Alvarez early in his UFC career. The number of clean shots he's absorbed across his career without going down is remarkable. Most fighters who get hit as much as Gaethje does would have been knocked out cold years ago. His chin is legitimately durable, but here's why he's level 4 and not higher. He does get stopped, he does get hurt, and the sheer volume of damage he absorbs means his chin has taken more punishment than almost anyone in lightweight history. The durability is undeniable, but the damage accumulation is real. That's level 4, a chin that lets you fight recklessly and survive, but the bill comes due eventually. Level 5. Level 5 is Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz has one of the most legendary chins in UFC history. In a career spanning over 30 fights in the UFC against some of the best fighters in the world, Diaz has only been stopped by strikes once. One time. And that was a head kick from Josh Thompson that was more of a TKO than a clean knockout. Diaz has never been knocked out cold. Not by Conor McGregor, who is one of the most precise knockout artists in UFC history. Not by Jorge Masvidal. Not by Leon Edwards. Not by any of the killers he's fought across nearly 2 decades in the sport. McGregor hit Diaz clean multiple times across 2 fights. In their first fight, Diaz ate the best shots McGregor had and just kept coming forward until McGregor gassed out. In their second fight, Diaz absorbed punishment across 5 rounds and was still fighting hard in the championship rounds. What makes Diaz's chin so special is that he doesn't just survive shots, he barely reacts to them. Other fighters get hit clean, and you can see them wobble or grab a clinch to recover. Diaz gets hit clean and just nods at you or throws his hands up like it didn't hurt. Whether that's genuinely how he feels or just incredible toughness is impossible to know, but the effect is devastating psychologically. You hit Nate Diaz with your best shot, and he looks at you like it was nothing. That breaks fighters mentally. That's level 5. A chin so tough that you've basically never been knocked out cold, and you make elite knockout artists question their own power. Level 6. Level 6 is Max Holloway. Before Ilia Topuria knocked him out at UFC 308, Max Holloway had never been knocked down in 29 UFC fights. Not once. He had absorbed over 2,223 significant strikes across his career, the most in UFC history, and had never touched the canvas from a punch. Think about that. The man who has been hit more than any fighter in UFC history had never been dropped. He fought Dustin Poirier, Jose Aldo twice, Alexander Volkanovski 3 times, Calvin Kattar, Yair Rodriguez, and Justin Gaethje. You know, all of them are elite strikers. All of them hit him clean, and none of them could put him down. Holloway's chin isn't just durable, it's historically unprecedented at featherweight. The way he fights requires an elite chin because he stands right in the pocket and trades. He doesn't fight on the outside and avoid damage like Adesanya. He walks into the fire and engages in prolonged boxing exchanges where he's getting hit as much as he's hitting. His style only works because his chin is so reliable that he can trust it to hold up through 25 minutes of constant warfare. What makes Holloway level 6 and not level 7 is that Topuria eventually did crack the code. In the 3rd round at UFC 308, Topuria landed a combination that knocked Holloway out for the first time in his career. It took the hardest hitting featherweight champion in history to do it, and it took 3 rounds of setting it up. But it happened. The chin that nobody could crack finally cracked. That's level 6. A chin so legendary that it took years and the most dangerous puncher in the division to finally find the off switch. Level 7. Level 7 is Mark Hunt. Mark Hunt is the greatest chin in UFC heavyweight history, and possibly the greatest chin the sport has ever seen. In a division where everyone has one-punch knockout power, where every strike thrown can end a fight instantly, Hunt absorbed bombs from the scariest punchers in the world and kept fighting. Junior Dos Santos, one of the hardest-hitting heavyweights ever, hit Hunt with everything he had in their fight at UFC 160. It was one of the greatest heavyweight fights in history, because JDS was landing clean power shots that would have knocked out any other heavyweight, and Hunt just kept walking through them. Stipe Miocic, who went on to become the greatest heavyweight champion in UFC history, hit Hunt clean and couldn't put him away easily. Alistair Overeem, Antonio Silva, Derrick Lewis, all of them threw their best at Hunt. He took shots from all of them. Hunt fought in the UFC heavyweight division for over a decade and was never knocked out cold from strikes in a way that left him unconscious on the canvas in the traditional sense. He absorbed a higher volume of clean heavyweight power shots than almost anyone in history, from a wider variety of elite knockout artists, and his chin held up through all of it. What makes Hunt level 7 isn't just the durability, it's the context. This is the heavyweight division. These are 265-pound men throwing punches with genuine life-altering power. A clean shot from Francis Ngannou carries the equivalent force of a small car crash. Hunt fought in an era where every opponent was trying to take his head off, and his chin was the one thing nobody could break. The Super Samoan walked through shots that would have killed lesser men. He didn't use head movement or defensive boxing to avoid punishment. He just ate it, clean, repeatedly, from the hardest hitters on the planet, and kept walking forward. That's level 7, the indestructible chin. A chin so strong that an entire division of the hardest-hitting humans on Earth couldn't shut it off.